Hey everybody. This is an article from the Trotsky Reappraisal, edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. It's by Richard Day, and it's titled Between Hegel and Habermas, The Political Theory of Leon Trotsky. 50 years after the death of Leon Trotsky is an appropriate time to suggest general conclusions concerning Trotsky's place in history. Judgments of this kind can be facilitated by situating a thinker within the tradition of which he is a part. I shall attempt to do this by relating Trotsky to his predecessors, Hegel, Marx, and Engels, to his most important contemporaries, Lenin, Bukharin, and Stalin, and also to a modern social theorist, Jürgen Habermas, whose work may help to clarify Trotsky's accomplishments as well as some of Trotsky's limitations. My approach will be to begin with Hegel and Marx, concentrating upon themes to which I shall return in my discussion of Trotsky. These include 1. The role of consciousness in making history, 2. The institutional relations between political and economic life, and 3. The tension between Hegel and Marx concerning the claims of practical and technical reason. By selecting these 3 themes, I hope to demonstrate what I take to be Trotsky's most unique contribution as a theorist of socialist transition, namely, Trotsky's attempt to reconcile Hegel and Marx by emphasizing the political dimension of economic planning. In my conclusion, I shall consider why Habermas believes such a reconciliation cannot be fully accomplished. New section. Hegel, Marx, and Engels. Hegelian philosophy is committed to the view that human beings are destined to create their own destiny. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel interpreted the history of culture as the coming to be of consciousness. Interpreted the history of culture as the coming to be of conscious self-determination. I'm going to read the Wikipedia to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Actually, I'm going to try to find the German Wikipedia of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Forgive this detour, but I think it'll help. It'll make the rest of the recording more sensible. The Phenomenology of Spirit is the first major work of the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, published in 1807. Phenomenology of Spirit represents the first part of his system of science. The quote phenomenology was to be followed by a presentation of the quote real sciences, the quote philosophy of nature, and that of the quote spirit. In this science of the manifestations of spirit, Hegel develops the rise of the spirit from simple, naive perception through consciousness, self-awareness, reason, spirit and history, revelation, and finally to the absolute knowledge of the world's spirit. In doing so, Hegel examines the development of science as a unity of content and method, and the manifestations of the spirit as the realization of ourself, as a unity of being and nothingness, and as an absolute whole. The locus of truth is the concept in the scientific system, not intuition. The knowledge of truth lies in the insight that the opposition between subject and object is dialectically resolved at a higher level. Since one cannot exist without the other, both therefore form a unity. The work deals with fundamental questions of epistemology, as well as ethics and the philosophy of history. Of particular importance is the reception of the chapter on self-consciousness, which contains the dialectical consideration of domination and servitude, and was an essential starting point for Marx's preoccupation with the analysis of class relations in bourgeois society. The Phenomenology of Spirit is considered to be Hegel's first typical work, and one which he later referred to again and again. Here Hegel attempts to systematically work out all the important topics that had previously occupied Hegel. In it, he deals with the positions that dominated the philosophical discourse of the time, Immanuel Kant's dualism, Jacobi's immediacy thinking, and Schelling's philosophy of identity. Hegel initially conceived the work as a systematic introduction to his philosophical system. The first three parts, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, were later included in an abbreviated form as the second moment of subjective spirit in the system of the Encyclopedia of 1817. In 1812, Hegel published The Science of Logic, which refers to phenomenology in the preface. In the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, first published in 1817, Hegel incorporated many of its questions into the, quote, science of spirit. The next section of the Wikipedia is titled Content Overview. The table of contents provides an overview. The first edition already had two content divisions, originally 1 through 7, and later added by Hegel. And it says ACDD. I don't know what that means. I guess it's sections he included. I don't know. Preface. The program of phonology is presented. Introduction. What does recognition mean? 1. Sensual certainty. Next section. Section 1. Sensual certainty, or the this and the opinion. A. Consciousness. Section 2, or Chapter 2. Perception, or the thing and the illusion. A. Consciousness. 3. Power and understanding. Appearance in the supernatural world. A. Consciousness. Consciousness. Consciousness's stages are sensory, certainty, perception, and understanding. I guess that's a description of the findings of that for those first 3 chapters. Chapter 4. The truth of certainty of oneself. B. Self-consciousness. And the summary of that says, self-consciousness experiences independence and dependence, resolves the conflict between master and servant, and achieves a first feeling of freedom, the unhappy consciousness of the Roman Empire which leads to Christianity, is the precursor to reason. Chapter 5. Certainty and truth of reason. Through observation of nature, she attains her first forms of self-knowledge, realizes her self-confidence, and develops her individuality. That's the description. Chapter 6. The Spirit. Morality is the true substance of the spirit. As law, the spirit is in its objective form. In its alienated form, spirit appears as education and enlightenment. Morality is the reflected unity of law and morality. In it, the awareness that the spirit is the only substance appears as pure knowledge. 7. Religion. In Christianity, the revealed religion, consciousness appears in the form of the idea that God is essentially spirit. And 8. Absolute knowledge. The absolute spirit is basically only in the form of knowledge of itself and not of anything external to it. The spirit is thus both subject and object. As it becomes conscious of this, its knowledge of itself becomes absolute knowledge. I guess this is like the description of the book, and it says, the next section says advertising copy. Advertisement in the intelligence bulletin of the Jena or Allgemeine Literatur-Zeitung of the 28th of October 1807. It says, quote, this volume presents emerging knowledge. The phenomenology of spirit is intended to take the place of psychological explanations or abstract discussions about the foundation of knowledge. It considers the preparation for science from a point of view which makes it a new, interesting, and the first science of philosophy. It encompasses the various forms of the spirit as stations on the path through which it becomes pure knowledge or absolute spirit. Therefore, in the main sections of this science, which are again divided into several conscious, self-conscious, observing, and acting reason, the spirit itself as a moral, educated, and ethical spirit, and finally as a religious spirit in its various forms, are considered. The wealth of the phenomena of the spirit, which at first glance appears as chaos, is brought into a scientific order, which presents itself according to its necessity, in which the imperfect ones dissolve and pass into higher ones, which are their closest truth. The ultimate truth is found first in religion and then in science, i.e., the result of the whole. In the preface, the author explains what he thinks philosophy needs from its current standpoint. Further, the presumption and nonsense of philosophical formulas that currently degrade philosophy, and what is important in philosophy and its study in general. The second volume will contain the system of logic as speculative philosophy and the two remaining parts of philosophy, the science of nature and of the mind, end quote. And this is like a broader description. The first section says, Preface. The preface to the phenomenology of spirit is not only extensive, but also complex in content. Therefore, only central ideas will be presented here. The preface begins with Hegel's disappointment, which will surely surprise some readers, of the usual expectation of a preface, namely that it outlines the intentions and results of the author's research work, and that it delimits and distances itself from all previous false representations by others. Hegel initially makes his idea of philosophical science clear in a graphic way by comparing it to the growth of a plant, and at the same time lets us experience what he intends in his preface, namely the gradual introduction of the reader to his unfamiliar dialectical way of thinking, without which his science cannot be understood. Quote, the bud disappears when the flower appears, and one could say that the bud is refuted by the flower, just as the fruit declares the flower to be a false existence of the plant, and the latter takes the place of the latter as its truth. These forms not only differ, but also displace one another as incompatible with one another, but their fluid nature simultaneously makes them moments of organic unity, in which they not only do not conflict, but one is as necessary as the other, and this same necessity is what constitutes the life of the whole, end quote. Hegel. The whole of truth cannot be meaningfully understood without the seemingly contradictory development of the, quote, parts from one another, which advances from an inner goal. Likewise, the truth of philosophy can only be developed and presented as a developing whole of apparently contradictory ways of thinking. Therefore, the preface cannot outline, quote, results, end quote, and cannot distance itself from previous false opinions, but must present the movement of thought itself in its living development, even if the presentation of opinions, goals, and intentions retains its value as the prerequisite and beginning of science. Hegel sees himself at a turning point in thought, in which a qualitative leap occurs after the previous ways of thinking have exhausted each other. The result of this leap, however, is not yet the fully developed new system of science, but initially its simple concept, which can seem incomprehensible and esoteric. The opposing philosophical currents of his time, Kantianism, Fichte, and Romanticism, especially Schelling, therefore initially reject the new. Quote, one part insists on the richness of the material and its comprehensibility. The other at least disdains these and insists on immediate rationality and divinity. End quote. Hegel. What is new in Hegel's understanding of science compared to the formalistically conceived substance A equals A, or the felt substance is the special subject character of the absolute? Quote, in my opinion, which must justify itself through the presentation of the system itself. Everything depends on understanding and expressing the truth, not as substance, but just as much as subject, end quote. Hegel particularly tries to overcome the Kantian dualism that was prevalent in Germany at the time. Hegel finds all previous philosophies inadequate because they remain stuck in opposing viewpoints. They fall apart into contradictory positions and do not understand the contradictions that arise between them as an essential moment of truth. His program is to establish philosophy as a science. However, according to Hegel's diagnosis, the scientific viewpoint must first be achieved. He sees it as an introduction to science, or as science that is still in the process of becoming. Quote, this becoming of science in general, or of knowledge, is what this phenomenology of spirit represents. End quote. Hegel examines consciousness as it is immediately present in order to advance from consciousness to true or absolute knowledge. To achieve this, the mind must understand what knowledge itself is. For Hegel, consciousness as it is immediately present in the appearing mind, it is the object of phenomenology. Hegel's principle is, quote, the true is the whole. The whole, however, is only the essence that perfects itself through its development. It can be said of the absolute that it is essentially a result, that it is only at the end what it is in truth. And this is precisely the absolute's nature, to be reality, subject, or becoming itself, end quote. Hegel is alluding here to Kant's transcendental dialectic in his critique of pure reason, in which reason aims at the totality of the conditions of knowledge, and with it at the conditioned unconditional. According to his prognosis, Kant only achieves a subjective philosophy of reflection because, for him, the unconditional cannot be an object of objectively valid knowledge, and thus, as Hegel says, it remains in infinite opposition to the absolute. For Hegel, totality is not only the object of reason, not just a superior principle, but the, quote, movement of reason itself in its self-comprehension, which is at the same time the comprehension of its condition, end quote. Hegel therefore says that truth does not consist in holding on to a rigid result, but only the interaction of the result and the development of the whole constitutes truth. For Hegel, the truth is only real as a system, and it must express only the spiritual as the real. For Hegel, knowledge seems to have gained its absolute standpoint in the knowledge of the spirit about itself. Only the spirit, while going out of itself, remains at the same time in itself. In order to be able to guarantee this inwardness of the spirit and not to linger in empirical intuition or accept it uncritically, philosophy must undertake the effort of the concept. The method of this science must be able to represent the movement of the thing itself. And there's a new section, Introduction. The subject of the introduction to the phenomenology of spirit is first a critique of Kant's distinction between things in themselves and things for us. Hegel believes that this distinction blocks our path to knowledge of the absolute truth, and that this distinction is meaningless. Hegel prefers a completely different path, one that he calls the, quote, path of despair, end quote. By this, Hegel means that the philosopher only has to describe the course of so-called natural self-consciousness without interfering. Consciousness must take on different forms, whose inadequacies consciousness must recognize, and thereby be able to obtain a different form. According to Hegel, the goal of this movement is the absolute spirit, where consciousness finally understands itself as the end and the beginning of its own movement. The starting point of the phenomenology of spirit is Kant's transcendental philosophy, in which the conditions of the possibility of knowledge and the interaction of intuition understanding and self-consciousness, synthetic unity of apperception are examined. Hegel now does not want to see self-consciousness as something merely given by Kant, but rather to understand self-consciousness's historical process of becoming in order to prove how consciousness progresses to consciousness of itself in order to realize itself as spirit in this reflexive transcendence. In his thinking, man reveals not only the logic of being, but also his selfhood. The most elementary consciousness of the knowledge of existence is, quote, sensory certainty, end quote. In the course of the chapter of the same name, Hegel tries to show that, quote, what it, bracket, sensory certainty, end bracket, knows is only this, it is, end quote. Starting from the perceived existence of its pure, as yet undetermined self, quote, this, and of the as yet undetermined objects, quote, this, as well as their two forms of the here and now, sensory certainty recognizes the universality of these. No matter what we perceive sensually, the here and now remains. And, quote, such a simple thing which through negation is neither this nor that, a non-this, and just as indifferent to being this as well as that, we call a universal. End quote. Quote, subsequently, sensory certainty recognizes the universality of the self, as well as the mediation of these universalities. End quote. Through, quote, desire, things appear to be the subject as an external reality separated from him. As an active self, man negates existence through his actions, and with the transformation of existence, he changes himself. With this nothingness, the negation within himself, he's becoming in time and history. With animal desire, he develops merely a physical sense of self, only insofar as his desire relates not merely to a given consumable object, but to something non-existent. Does his existence transcend to self-consciousness, which can free itself from the entrapment of existence and attain autonomy and freedom. New section, self-consciousness. New section, domination and servitude. In the multitude of desires which can exclude each other, man comes into conflict with his fellow human beings. In the fight for recognition, the loser becomes dependent on the victor, which leads him into slavery. Through the work of the servant, the master gains freedom over nature. But the work of the servant brings about an increase in thought, technology, science, and art, and progress towards an idea of freedom that can free the servant in a revolutionary way from dependence on his master. History is a process of work and struggle for recognition, a history of the dialectic of domination and servitude, which leads to a synthesis of domination and servitude. New section, absolute knowledge. Quote, absolute knowledge is presented at the end of the work. This is not all-encompassing or perfect knowledge in the sense that nothing more can be known. In the end, according to Hans Friedrich Fulda, thinking is more of, quote, an act and, quote, active knowledge, end quote, or knowledge in the movement of reflection, because it is only expressed in its other, i.e. in the determination of the object, end quote. In absolute knowledge, subject and object coincide, not in such a way that there is no longer any difference between consciousness and the object of consciousness, but in such a way that the movement of self-mediation fully becomes conscious, and the spirit thereby recognizes itself as the substance or the reason for this very mediation. The forms of absolute knowledge exist as revealed religion and philosophy. It is only in revealed religion that the awareness arises that God is in truth spirit. God is in truth spirit. Quote, the content of the imagination is the absolute spirit, end quote. Quote, science contains within science's self this necessity of divesting science's self of the forms of the pure concept and the transition of the concept into consciousness. The transition of the concept into consciousness. For the spirit that knows itself, precisely because it grasps its concept, is the immediate equality with itself, which in its difference is the certainty of the immediate, or the sensuous consciousness, the beginning from which we started. This release of itself from the form of itself is the highest freedom and certainty of its knowledge of itself." End quote. In revealed religion, the absolute spirit is presented as that which underlies the historical process. It turns out that it is possible to grasp reality as substance. In this way, religion passes into absolute knowledge. Quote, "It therefore turns out that reality conceived as substance must be understood as subject." End quote. Final section. Standpoint of idealism. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is prefigured from the standpoint of idealism as expressed in Fichte's thinking, which traces all knowledge back to the spontaneous self-certainty of the absolutely posited ego, self-consciousness. According to Fichte, this is the first cause and the absolute basis of the world. However, all that remains of Fichte's philosophy in Hegel is the starting point, subjectivity. According to Fichte, the absolute cannot be known, only believed. Hegel also implicitly distances himself from Schelling, or for whom everything outside the ego is nature, and we can only observe but not understand. For him, the standard for testing the truth of knowledge, for the knowledge of the absolute, lies in consciousness itself. In this respect, his position can be described as idealistic. Hegel therefore wants to raise the uneducated natural consciousness to the level of science. Perception and sensation are to be brought into a linguistically formulated general, i.e. into general concepts. Only in this way is there is perception and sensation's comprehension possible, and this is where perception and sensation experience their dialectical movement. In what Hegel calls, quote, reason, in the main chapter of the same name, thinking is identified with being. Quote, reason is the certainty of consciousness that it is all reality. This is how idealism expresses its concept. End quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. In its development, the mind inevitably always comes into contradictions, and reason succeeds in taking this up and developing new concepts. As, quote, spirit, the, quote, absolute identity becomes moral self-consciousness. Finally, in the Christian religion, the, quote, incarnation of the divine being, end quote, is also interpreted in a general sense, as a revelation of the unity of human self-consciousness with the divine. Critics of Hegel's dialectic, such as Bernhard Lackerbrink, point out, among other things, that Hegel wrongly attributes an effective power to nothing. However, this would mean that nothing would not be nothing, but a form of being. If one really wanted to equate being with non-being, ultimately every statement and that statement's opposite would be true, and Hegelian science would thus be at an end. Okay, sorry about that. I had to look that up. And there's probably a lot of things that I could look up here. So I won't do that again. The phenomenology treated consciousness as subjective spirit. The philosophy of right turned to objective spirit, or consciousness going out of itself to create its own world in laws and social institutions. You know what? I'm gonna look that up too. I'm feeling saucy. I've already ruined this recording by going on that detour. Let's go on some more detours. This one's not as long, actually. The outlines of the philosophy of right or natural law and political science in outline is a work by the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, published in October 1820. The Principles of the Philosophy of Right was originally intended to serve as an accompanying textbook to Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of right at the University of Berlin. It is considered the central presentation of Hegel's philosophy of objective spirit, alongside the corresponding section of his encyclopedia and various lecture notes. What Hegel defines as, quote, philosophy of law, end quote, corresponds to the content of what he calls, quote, objective spirit, end quote, i.e. the realization of free will in the social sphere. The term, quote, law is defined very broadly and includes everything that, as a system of general norms, enables mutually recognizing individuals to live together, and in Hegel's view, only thereby enables the realization of freedom of will. Accordingly, the basic concept of the basic principles is that the, quote, existence of free will, is that of the, quote, existence of free will, end quote, the conceptual development of which within the Hegelian system stands at the end of the philosophy of subjective spirit. This existence has three aspects, quote, abstract law, corresponding to what is generally understood as natural law, morality, i.e. supposedly autonomous action, and, quote, ethicality, end quote, i.e. social orders in which people are given the right options for action. Central to this is the representation of a political order in which, for Hegel, freedom is fully realized. The preface is one of the well-known Hegel texts, thanks in particular to the following epigram, quote, what is reasonable is real, and what is real is reasonable, end quote. Hegel, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right. Reason and ideality are explicitly equated. Reason and reality are explicitly equated. The real is reasonable because the real has emerged from the real's concept. The rational is real because the rational is the constant in existence. Conversely, not everything that exists is also reasonable. There is much in what exists that is subject to chance or human arbitrariness, but the accidental and arbitrary do not correspond to the concept. The Owl of Minerva. In the preface, Hegel also comments on the relationship of philosophers to social reality and thus provides a further explanation of the above quotation. Quote, when philosophy paints its gray on gray, then a figure of life has grown old, and with gray on gray it cannot be rejuvenated, but only recognized. The Owl of Minerva only begins its flight with the approaching dusk, end quote. Hegel, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right. The Roman goddess Minerva, as well as the Greek Athena, were the guardians of wisdom and had as their mythological attribute the bird of wisdom, the nocturnal owl. According to this metaphor, an understanding of social conditions is only possible after the reality is unfolded. Knowledge, therefore, concludes an epoch and does not establish an epoch. Many interpretations, therefore, see in Hegel's late work, which also includes the philosophy of law, a departure from the earlier position that philosophy should found a new era. According to Hegel, law is what is desired and generally recognized as law. In section 4 of the introduction, it says, quote, the basis of law is generally the spiritual, and its closer location and starting point is the will, which is free, so that freedom constitutes its substance and determination, and the legal system is the realm of realized freedom, the world of the spirit produced from it, as a second nature, end quote. Law is spirit, which passes from subjectivity to objectivity. According to Hegel, 3 dialectical stages form the realization of law, quote, abstract law, quote, morality, quote, ethicality. Each of them contains an element of law. The following stage builds on the previous one. Hegel's philosophy, accordingly, has a 3-part structure, which is typical for many of his works. All right, back to the text. In his phenomenology of spirit, Hegel interpreted the history of culture as the coming to be of conscious self-determination. The phenomenology treated consciousness as subjective spirit, the philosophy of right turned to objective spirit, or consciousness going out of consciousness itself to create consciousness's own world in laws and social institutions. Hegel began with property as the initial determination of the will. By embodying his will in property, a person exists as a reason and at the same time becomes his own object. Footnote, see Hegel's philosophy of right. But this initial identity of subject and object also implies being for another. Thus, property issues in contract and mediation into a common will through mutual recognition between property owners. When the right to property is subsequently exposed to wrong, Hegel contends that the abstract rights of property owners presuppose a higher universal in the state and the laws. Our most fundamental claims upon the material world turn out to be subjective claims upon other people. Property is a social relation and is inconceivable without a state. Because of its logical priority, it is the idea of the state which determines itself in the production and exchange relations of civil society. Hegel regarded civil society as the system of needs, which is mediated unconsciously through division of labor in the market. But the division of labor also creates corporate bodies, which consciously seek recognition of particular needs and interests. The contradictory claims of corporations presuppose determination of their rights. If the laws of the state are to uphold subjective freedom, corporate bodies must regard the laws as their own self-determination. Freedom is self-determination of necessity. The universality of the laws requires mutual interpenetration of the state and civil society. The presence of the political state in the corporations is signified through selection of their officers by a combination of election and appointment. Conversely, the corporations establish themselves in the state through appointing deputies to the legislature. The role of deputies is to ensure that, quote, the state enters into the subjective consciousness of the people and, the people begins to participate in the state, end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Right. As determinations of thought, the laws are universal. The ethical purpose which they articulate can enter simultaneously into the consciousness of all the particulars of civil society. The Hegelian state was the concrete universal of ethical life, the agency responsible for mediating between particulars, and the universal was the civil service or the universal class. Should the universal class attempt to set the universal class's own interests before the needs of the community, Hegel believed the rightful authority vested in corporations would constitute an institutional barrier to, quote, subjective caprice, end quote. Hegel. Corporations completed, quote, from below, end quote, the system of state control from above. Corporations would prevent the civil service from assuming the, quote, isolated position of an aristocracy and using its education and skill as a means to arbitrary tyranny, end quote. Hegel. Hegel claims that individuals and corporate bodies, quote, have duties to the state in proportion as they have rights against the state, end quote. Hegel. The highest labor of citizens was to create laws and institutions which, as expressions of social consciousness, also determine the consciousness of citizens. The dialectical movement was a circle of necessity, wherein universal truth became practical truth in the rightful consciousness of the people. Theory and practice were reconciled in the identity of subject and object. In subjectively authoring the laws, the people had their own consciousness as their object. Karl Marx's earliest response to Hegel's philosophy of right enunciated a theme that would prevail in all of Marx's subsequent writings. Quote, the political constitution is the constitution of private property, end quote. Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. End footnote. I'm going to look up Marx's Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. On A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right is a text by Karl Marx from the years 1843 and 1844. The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right consists of a critique of Hegel's constitutional law, written between March and August 1843, which was first published in 1927, and an introduction written between 1843 and 1844, which was published in 1844. The former text is also known as the Kreuznach manuscript. A manuscript of this text consisting of 39 sheets exists. Marx had paginated the numbers with Roman numerals. The first manuscript sheet has not survived. The work was not published during Marx's lifetime. In it, he deals in detail with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's work, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right, published in 1821. In particular, Marx points out the abstract nature of Hegel's concept of the state. The famous text appeared in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher in 1844. Marx begins his text with the concept of the critique of religion, and then describes religion as the, quote, opium of the people, end quote, thereby exaggerating a formulation by Heinrich Heine. However, in the sense of emancipation, Marx believes that, in addition to a, quote, critique of heaven, a, quote, critique of politics is necessary, which cannot be achieved through philosophy alone, but only through the actions of the proletariat class. At the end of his introduction, Marx contrasts Hegel's image of philosophy as the, quote, owl of Minerva, which, quote, only begins its flight with the approach of dusk, end quote, with the, quote, blaring of the Gallic cock, end quote, through which, quote, when all internal conditions are fulfilled, end quote, the, quote, German day of resurrection, end quote, will be announced. Back to the text. Karl Marx's earliest response to Hegel's philosophy of right enunciated a theme that would prevail in all of Marx's subsequent writings, quote, the political constitution is the constitution of private property, end quote. Hegel argued that the idea of the state creates civil society. Marx replied that civil society creates the state. Because both are grounded in private property, the state loses the state's claim to universality by excluding the property list from political life. Marx considered the Hegelian state to be a false universal, in which the civil service was one particular interest amongst many. It represented a, quote, hierarchy of knowledge, but rather than expressing the spirit of the community, bureaucrats demanded deference and, quote, dumb obedience. The truth of the political state was that every bureaucrat used it for purposes of self-promotion. In The German Ideology, Marx and Engels translated Hegel's philosophy of consciousness into the objective history of human coming to be. I'm going to look this up too, because I am feeling saucy. The German Ideology is a collection of manuscripts written between 1845 and 1846, mainly by Karl Marx and in parts by Friedrich Engels and occasionally by Moses Hess, Josef Weidemeyer, and Roland Daniels. But only a small part of it was published at the time, together with the Theses on Feuerbach, written by Marx in 1845, and also unpublished during his lifetime. The German Ideology is considered a key work of historical materialism. Of the text that later became known under the title The German Ideology, only one article by Marx was published during the author's lifetime. The longest text in the work, the Critique of Max Stirner, which amounts to about 2/3 of the total volume, was published in 1903/1904 in excerpts in 9 volumes of the series Documents of Socialism under the title St. Max by Edward Bernstein. Bernstein thus intervened in the debate about anarchist forms of socialism prompted by the so-called Stirner Renaissance. The section with the criticism of Ludwig Feuerbach, published in 1926 by David Ryazanov, is a reprint for the Marx-Engels. The section with the criticism of Ludwig Feuerbach was published in 1926 by David Ryazanov as a reprint for the Marx-Engels complete edition. Ryazanov was planning before he was murdered by the Stalinist state. The entire German ideology was first published in 1932 in volumes 1 of 5 of Mega in Berlin, after Ryazanov's arrest, with Vladimir Adoratsky as editor. In the same year, Siegfried Landshut and Jakob P. Mayer published a heavily abridged version as part of an edition of Marx's early writings, in which the Stirner section, 2/3 of the entire text, was missing. The first complete print in an edition of the works appeared in 1933 in Volume 4 of the first Russian-language Marx-Engels Works edition. At the same time, the German Ideology is published in the USSR on the occasion of Marx's 115th birthday in May 1933 in a single edition with a print run of over 50,000 copies. As part of the German-language Marx-Engels Works, the German Ideology was finally published in 1958 in Volume 3 of the edition. A revised version of this appeared in Moscow in 1965 and in the GDR in 1966. For the second Marx-Engels complete edition, Mega 2, a trial volume was produced in 1972 in which the Feuerbach chapter was commented on and edited according to the latest research. On this basis, Wataru Hiromatsu published a further version in Tokyo in 1974 with a new arrangement of the text. The publication of the newly edited 1/5 of Mega, or 1 of 5 of Mega 2, which contains the German ideology, had been announced several times since the trial volume of 1972, but due to the extremely difficult source situation, and the need to incorporate new research results, it was finally only published at the end of November 2017 on a total of 1,894 pages. The historical critical edition led, among other things, to the inclusion of 2 further texts, an anonymous article in the journal Gesellschaftsspiegel, but attributed to Marx, and an article by Josef Weidemeyer from the Westfälischen Dampfboot, which he had written in Brussels with the collaboration of Marx. The publication of the Mega volume after decades of editorial work also generated media resonance. The German Ideology criticizes the young Hegelian philosophers Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, and Max Stirner, as well as contemporary German socialists. In the German Ideology, Marx and Engels establish a connection between people's living conditions and their thoughts. In particular, the thoughts of people of a certain era, region, and social position about morals, ethical concepts, ideals of beauty, etc., are always a reflection of the specific conditions of that era, region, and social class, and stratum, etc. To put it simply, it is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. The different living conditions in a certain era, and region are reflected in a hierarchical order of the various classes. The thoughts of the members of all classes serve to secure the dominance of the class that benefits most from the respective social structure. The dominant thoughts are always the thoughts of the rulers. The interests of the ruling class are presented as those supposedly common to all members of society. Marx and Engels refer to ideas that serve the interests of the ruling class and are presented as the only valid ones as ideology. Ideology can be exposed by criticism, but can only be eliminated by revolutionary practice. Quote, revolutionary practice, as Marx wrote in the third thesis on Feuerbach, by changing the material conditions. The German ideology marks the boundary between the so-called early and the mature Marx, i.e. Marx's break with the humanistic materialism of Feuerbach. It contains, as Engels wrote, the first formulation of Marx's, quote, great theory, historical materialism. The historical materialism part is not in quotes from Engels, I should note. In the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, Marx addresses the background to the work. Quote, Friedrich Engels, with whom I had maintained a constant written exchange of ideas since the publication of his brilliant sketch of the Critique of Economic Categories in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, had reached the same result as me by a different route. Compare his situation of the working class in England. And when he also settled in Brussels in the spring of 1845, we decided to work out together the opposition of our view to the ideological view of German philosophy. In fact, to settle accounts with our former philosophical conscience. The intention was carried out in the form of a critique of post-Hegelian philosophy. The manuscript, 2 thick octavo volumes, had long since arrived at its publishing house in Westphalia, when we received the news that changed circumstances did not permit printing. We left the manuscript to the gnawing criticism of the mice, all the more willingly as we had achieved our main goal, self-understanding, end quote. Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. In 1888, in a preface to Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels commented on the manuscript as follows, quote, Before I sent these lines to the press, I looked at the old manuscripts from 1845-46 again. The section on Feuerbach is not finished. The finished part consists of an exposition of the materialist conception of history, which only proves how incomplete our knowledge of economic history was at the time. The critique of Feuerbach's doctrine itself is missing from it. It was therefore useless for the present purpose. On the other hand, I found the 11 theses on Feuerbach printed in the appendix in an old notebook by Marx. They are notes for later elaboration, written quickly, absolutely not intended for print, but invaluable as the first document in which the brilliant germ of the new worldview is laid down, end quote. And there's a section that says abstract, and it has a quote in it. Quote, the thoughts of the ruling class are the ruling thoughts in every epoch, i.e. the class which is the ruling material power of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual power. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal also has the means of intellectual production at its disposal, so that the thoughts of those who lack the means of intellectual production are also subject to it on average. The ruling thoughts are nothing more than the ideal expression of the ruling material conditions. The ruling material conditions conceived as thoughts, that is, of the conditions which make one class the ruling class, that is, the thoughts of its rule, end quote. And then there's a section that says criticism. It says, the German ideology, a central work by Marx and Engels, never existed in the published form of the Marx-Engels works, MEW. The chapter 1, Feuerbach, in particular, was originally intended as a critique of Max Stirner. Erlich Pagel, Harold Hubman, and Christina Weckvert come to the following conclusion in their work on the Marx-Engels complete works. Quote, instead of the formulation of a philosophy of historical materialism, claimed in later reception and suggested by text compilations, the manuscripts demonstrate precisely the programmatic turning away from philosophy in favor of real positive science. End quote. Back to the text. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels translated Hegel's philosophy of consciousness into an objective history of human coming to be. What men are at any particular time, they declared, is historically determined not by what they think, but by, quote, what they produce, ... and how they produce, end quote. German philosophy's, quote, empty talk about consciousness, end quote, as the spirit of the world and author of history, was now replaced by the real life process of satisfying physical needs. Consciousness did not produce the world, rather economic life produced consciousness as an expression in thought of objective class divisions over property. To transcend class divisions required the, quote, natural premises, end quote, of production to be collectively appropriated. The organization of communist society would be, quote, essentially economic, the material production of the conditions of this unity, end quote. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx had spoken of the human species character as, quote, free conscious activity, end quote. I have to take a break, I'm sorry. According to German Wikipedia, or I should rather say, I'm going to read the German Wikipedia on the economic philosophic manuscripts of 1844. The economic and philosophical manuscripts from 1844, also known as the Paris manuscripts, were written by Karl Marx in Paris between the end of May, beginning of June, and August 1844, and are among Marx's, quote, early writings. They were intended for self-understanding and were not published during his lifetime. Parts of the manuscripts have only survived in fragments. David Borisovich Ryazanov and Siegfried Landshut discovered these manuscripts in the late 1920s under the title National Economy and Philosophy in the SPD archives and published them for the first time in 1932 in their edition of Marx's early writings. The Paris manuscript are Marx's first work in which he combines the critique of economics with his materialist philosophy to form his own system. They are a document of the, quote, movement of Marx's thought away from the left Hegelians, end quote. They are a document of the, quote, movement of Marx's thought away from the left Hegelians, end quote, in the years 1843 to 1845. That quote is from a Michael Quanta. Important philosophical and economic concepts in the manuscripts are work, alienation, quote, objective species being, end quote, and recognition, as well as wages, quote, profit of capital, end quote, and ground rent. A central point in the manuscript is a historical materialist twist on Hegel's concept of alienation. Marx sees the worker as alienated in four ways. 1. Alienated from the product of his labor. 2. The productive activity becomes something external. 3. The alienation from the human species. 4. Alienation from other people. In this text, Marx sees alienated or alienation or alienated labor as the cause of private property. Quote, But when we analyze this concept, it becomes clear. Did I say quote? Quote. But when we analyze this concept, it becomes clear that if private property appears as the reason, as the cause of alienated labor, it is actually a consequence of alienated labor, just as the gods are originally not the cause, but the effect of the human mind's aberration. ... Wages are a direct consequence of alienated labor, and alienated labor is the direct cause of private property. End quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic, old manuscripts from the year 1844. The Economic and Philosophic manuscripts of 1844 consist of 3 booklets, which are not completely preserved, as well as a, quote, preface. The first booklet consists of 4 columns. Marx writes about wages. 1. Wages are determined as a commodity from the hostile struggle between capitalists and workers. When the economy declines, workers suffer the most. If the economy grows, the workload, alienation, and competition among workers also grow, and many capitalists become workers themselves. Since the worker has degenerated into a machine, machines can compete with him. Economic growth also leads to overproduction, which causes periodic crises. If the economy stagnates, wages fall due to the high level of competition. Regarding the profit of capital, Marx writes, capital was created through the right to property. Its profit can be maintained through monopolies, uniqueness of the goods, or through constant high demand. It can be increased through further processing into a higher value product and technological progress. Progress does not increase wages, but the profit of capital. The pursuit of capital by individuals is not always the most useful thing for a society. Competition between capitalists leads to an increase in wages, a reduction in market prices, a deterioration of goods, a fall in profits, and to many capitalists sinking into the working class. The accumulation of capital, on the other hand, leads to a monopoly that accumulates even more capital. In the chapter on ground rent, Marx states that landowners themselves demand a price for using the land and harvesting its fruits. Increased demand raises prices and benefits the landowners. This and the higher profitability lead to the accumulation of landed property. Competition between landowners turns them into capitalist and landed property industrial. Thus only 2 classes emerge in society, workers and capitalists. This process means the end of feudalism and the beginning of capitalism. Dissatisfaction will lead to a revolution that will demand the dissolution of monopolies. Regarding the concept of alienated labor, 4, Marx writes that the more wealth the worker produces, the poorer the worker becomes. The more goods the worker creates, the cheaper the worker becomes as a commodity. Being a commodity alienates the worker from his productive activity in the product, since it is no longer a direct means of subsistence or need for him. His freedom turns from an end to a mere means. Ultimately, man becomes alienated from himself. Only 1 chapter of the second manuscript has been preserved. Marx describes the relationship of private property as follows. The worker produces capital and capital produces the worker. The worker therefore works to maintain his class. If the worker did not do this, he could not exist. Agriculture becomes capitalist because agriculture no longer employs unfree farmers, but free workers. Marx also presents his idea of, quote, historical materialism, end quote, although he does not use this term. Chronologically, the course of history up to the revolution he foresees should therefore be structured in 3 stages. 1. Unity of labor and capital, primitive communism. 2. Opposition between labor and capital, transition from feudalism to capitalism. 3. Opposition of each against himself, culmination point of capitalism. The third manuscript is divided into 6 chapters. Here Marx relates individual concepts that have appeared previously to one another. On private property and work, Marx criticizes the fetishistic worship of commodities by economists. The perception of capitalism is para-religious. In private property and communism, Marx rejects Hegel's universalism. According to Hegel, the abolition of a concept is only possible through that concept's generalization. According to Marx, the abolition of capitalism would follow the same path as capitalism itself. In order to actually eliminate capitalism, however, all the stages of development that led to it would have to be passed through again, albeit in reverse, all the way to communism. In communism, private property belongs to everyone. In the first step, all individual differences between people are forcibly eliminated by making everyone work. In the second step, society abolishes its current democracy or despotism by abolishing the state, in which there is still general private property. Up to now, communism has not yet grasped the essence of people. This happens in the third step. Here, people become human and natural again. In communism, people can enjoy without owning anything. The now independent human being would know that he created himself was not created by God. A God, it says. Regarding needs and production, Marx writes, capitalist man is dependent on money because without money, capitalist man cannot fulfill his needs. So he, as a capitalist, uses products, or as a worker, his labor as bait to get what he needs. Money therefore becomes the only need, and natural needs are seen as a weakness. The need to accumulate money leads to natural needs, such as entertainment, exercise, or a varied diet being negated. Regarding the division of labor, Marx writes, according to Smith, the division of labor arose from human reason. It is the basis of trade. Only through trade does society arise. Economics sees the right to private property as a prerequisite for trade. Marx repeats these views without comment. In the chapter Money, Marx says that money is often understood ontologically in capitalism. This is because money can compensate for negative characteristics, e.g., laziness, ugliness. This turns everything into the opposite. Wanting without money leads to not being able. Not wanting with money leads to being able. In the last chapter, Critique of Hegel's Dialectics and Philosophy, Marx agrees with Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel. Philosophy as a form of religion is an alienation of man. A true materialism should prevail in human relationships. Feuerbach prefers the positive to the negation of the negative. Man is therefore not, as Hegel claims, a spiritual being, but a practical being. Marx also criticizes Hegel's positive view of the state and religion. They do not serve self-realization, but are alienating. The merits of Hegel's dialectic, however, are 1. The thesis that man creates himself through work. 2. The thesis that abolition can only be completed through generalization and later through its own abolition. Okay, thanks for that detour. Back to the text. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx had spoken of the human species character as, quote, free conscious activity, end quote. But to realize this potential, man had first to make, quote, his life activity itself the object of his will and consciousness, end quote. Marx. Self-determination of labor became the analog of the phenomenology's self-determination of spirit. In the Grundrisse, Marx saw material realization of this potential in modern technology as the mediating link between thinking and being. Following Hegel's emphasis upon the activity of reason, Marx found in civilized means of production the objectification both of physical labor and of human thought. Modern technologies represented actual reason. They were, quote, organs of the human brain created by the human mind, the power of knowledge objectified, end quote. Knowledge was becoming, quote, a direct force of production, end quote. And scientific labor, as the labor of thought, had the same potential for universalization as Hegel saw in the laws. Footnote. Marx, Grundrisse, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy. Modern reason, as the science of production, portended the rational organization of labor in an actual unity of subject and object. To realize this unity, however, presupposed universal appropriation of social knowledge and transcendence of the division between mental and physical labor. Communal ownership of property would give universality its objective dimension. Communal appropriation of objectified knowledge would represent the subjective universalization of reason. Marx believed conscious self-determination of social labor was already implicit in capitalism. Conscious self-determination of social labor's actualization in scientific planning required the universal worker as the counterpart of universal means of production. Modern industry had eliminated particular skills of handicraft workers and converted labor into a pure abstraction. But in order to work with the sophisticated instruments of embodied knowledge, the workers themselves must acquire universal skills. Capitalism had already posited the need for production of man himself as, quote, the most total and universal social product, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Technologically cultured workers had become the self-conscious regulators of their own social life process. The, quote, human being who has become, end quote, wrote Marx, would be the one, quote, who in whose head exists the accumulated knowledge of society, end quote. Marx. The absolute reason of Hegelian philosophy must be made concrete through social self-enlightenment. I'm going to see if there's anything for absolute reason. No, I'm not seeing anything. In The Philosophy of Right, Hegel had written that, quote, the abstraction of one man's production from another's makes work more and more mechanical, until finally man is able to step aside and install machines in his place, end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Right. In the Grundrisse, Marx elaborated this same theme, quote, labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator to the production process itself, ... He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. I'm going to read the German Wikipedia for the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse of the Critique of Political Economy, in the broad sense, or Grundrisse for short, is a manuscript that Karl Marx wrote in London from 1857 to 1858. Marx drafted a general introduction in the last week of August 1857. The manuscript that followed between the end of September 1857 and November 1858 forms the Grundrisse of the Critique of Political Economy in the narrower sense, and is also called the Rough Draft, after a letter from Marx to Engels. That's what it's referred to in Roman Rolsdalski's book, The Making of Marx's Capital. In the Grundrisse, Marx first developed the foundations and details of his theory of value, and based on this, his theory of surplus value. The Rough Draft is part of the preparatory work for Marx's main work, Das Kapital. The introduction was discovered by Karl Kautsky in 1902 in Marx's handwritten papers and published in March 1903 in the journal Die Neue Zeit. The complete Grundrisse was not were not found in the papers until 1923 by David Ryazanov, although this, of course, is not certain. It is probable that even Friedrich Engels did not read the Grundrisse. The rough draft of the manuscript, together with a more detailed version of the introduction and some other writings by Marx, was first published in 1939-41 by Pavel Veller in Moscow by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism at the Central Committee of the CPSU. A photomechanical reprint of the edition was published in 1953 by Karl Dietz Verlag, Berlin. After Marx moved to London in 1850, he began to continue his economic studies, which had been interrupted during the Revolution of 1848-49. In the library of the British Museum, Marx read the works of the bourgeois economists William Petty and Francois Quesnay, as well as the representatives of classical English economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Due to the economic crisis of 1857, Marx and Friedrich Engels saw the possibility of a revolution. Marx therefore worked intensively on his economic theory. First, he began fragmentary critique of the theory of the American economist Henry Charles Carey and the work Harmonie économique by the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, published in 1851. In it, Marx traces the transition from classical bourgeois economics to vulgar economics. He abandoned his work after 10 pages and wrote the introduction instead. Then in the manuscripts, the rough draft begins with a critique of the book De la Réforme des Banques by Alfred Darrimont, a follower of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. He wrote to Engels about his work on the 8th of December 1857, quote, "I am working like mad through the night on the summary of my economic studies, so that I have at least the outlines clear before the deluge," end quote. By the end of March 1858, the preliminary work was roughly completed. A publisher had already been found. For health reasons, however, Marx was unable to complete the manuscript and only finished the work in the autumn of 1858. However, he was dissatisfied with the presentation, went through the text again, and drafted a new plan for the third part, a contribution to the critique of political economy. The manuscripts, published in 1941, was not given a summary title by Marx. The editors chose this, quote, "on the basis of various passages in the letter," end quote. As Marx mentions in the preface to the Critique of Political Economy of January 1859, the introduction anticipates results in the form of theses. Marx's starting point in describing material production is individuals producing in society, and hence the social determined production of individuals. Marx describes the bourgeois economist's ideas of individuals who originally produced individually, for example, as isolated hunters and fishermen, as, quote, Robinsonades, end quote. Illusions through which the individual and free competition of bourgeois society that emerged between the 16th and 18th centuries is idealized. For Marx, on the other hand, the following applies, quote, "Man is, in the truest sense of the word, Zoonpolitiken, or not just a social animal, but an animal that can only become isolated in society," end quote. For Marx, the real historical stage of production cannot be understood from the general time-independent conditions of production. Real production is not, quote, general, but either a particular branch of production, e.g. agriculture, livestock, farming, manufacturing, etc., or it is the totality of an entire society. In particular, capital should not be understood in the abstract as the accumulated labor used as an instrument of production, but rather determined by the specific conditions of modern bourgeois production. Therefore, capital is not a general, eternal, natural relationship. According to Marx, production, distribution, exchange, consumption are the different parts of a totality. Distribution is not only the distribution of products, but also the instruments of production and of individuals under certain forms of production. Exchange for private consumption is also only apparently independent of production, but is determined on the basis of the division of labor, private production, and the development and structuring of production relations e.g. between town and country. Thus production is decisive. Production, quote, reaches over itself in the opposing determination of production, as well as over the other moments. From it the process begins again and again, end quote. On the other hand, production, quote, in its one-sided form, end quote, is determined by the other elements. Marx examines the relationship between concrete and abstract categories in economics. In doing so, Marx addresses the problem of the correct order in research and presentation. The path from the concrete population, via classes, wage labor, and capital, to increasing the abstract concepts such as exchange, division of labor, and price, was taken by the economists of the 17th century. The scientifically correct method, conversely, rises from the simple, such as work, division of labor, need, exchange value, up to the state, exchange between nations, and the world market. In this way, however, the concrete is merely reproduced in thought. Conceiving concrete reality as the result of thinking, on the other hand, is an illusion, which Marx accuses Hegel of. Quote, Hegel's philosophy of law correctly begins with property, as the simplest legal relationship of the subject. But property does not exist before the family or the relationships of domination and servitude, which are much more concrete relationships, end quote. Marx. The abstraction of the category itself has historical preconditions. For example, work seems to be a very simple, and in work's universality, ancient category, but it is only economically realized in the most modern bourgeois society, the United States, in which individuals change jobs with ease and the specific type of work is accidental and therefore indifferent to them. Thus, the abstraction of the categories valid for all epochs is a product of historical conditions. The categories are only fully valid for and within these. The categories for understanding bourgeois society also provide insight into the forms of society that have disappeared, from whose ruins and elements they have been built up. In comparison with previous societies, however, the categories in the current one are always developed, atrophied, or caricatured in essential differences. Marx uses the metaphor, quote, the anatomy of man is a key to the anatomy of the ape. The hints of higher things in the lower animal species, on the other hand, can only be understood if the higher things themselves are already known, ... One can understand tribute, tithes, etc. if one knows ground rent, but one does not have to identify them. End quote. Marx. A society is only capable of criticizing that society's self under very specific circumstances, otherwise that society views its predecessors one-sidedly as stages of a historical development towards itself. Quote, the Christian religion was only able to help to objectively understand earlier mythologies once its self-criticism had reached a certain level, so to speak. Thus, bourgeois economics only came to understand feudal, ancient, oriental economics once the self-criticism of bourgeois society had begun, end quote. Marx maintains that every historical and social science, quote, has a subject in its head, in this case modern bourgeois society, as in reality, and that the categories therefore express forms of existence, determinations of existence, often only individual aspects of this particular society, this subject, and that it therefore by no means begins scientifically when it is spoken of as such, end quote. In the first chapter of the introduction, Marx also comments on the unequal relationship between the development of material production and artistic production. Certain art forms can no longer be produced as soon as society enters into art production as such. Quote, is Achilles possible with gunpowder and lead, or even the, quote, Iliad, end quote, with the printing press and even more so the printing machine? Does not singing and saying and the muse with the press necessarily cease, and therefore do not necessary conditions of epic poetry disappear, end quote. Marx explains the pleasure offered by Greek art in modern times by the awareness of the irreversibility of social development. Quote, a man cannot become a child again, or he becomes childish, but does the child's naivety not please him, and must he not strive to reproduce his truth on a higher level? Does not the nature of children's nature live on its natural truth in every epoch? Why should the historical childhood of humanity, where it develops most beautifully, not exert eternal charm as a never-recurring stage? There are naughty children and precocious children. Many of the ancient peoples belong in this category. The Greeks were normal children. The charm of the Greeks' art for us is not in contradiction to the undeveloped social stage on which it grew. It is rather its result, and is inseparably concerned with the fact that the immature social conditions under which it arose can never return. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The Grundrisse was primarily received by Marxists who wanted to distance themselves from Marxism-Leninism. Roman Rozdolsky's presentation and interpretation of the genesis of Marx's Capital, the rough draft of Capital, 1857 to 1858, had a great influence on Western Marxism. The first complete translation of the Grundrisse was published in 5 volumes in Japanese from 1953 to 1965 under the title Kizegaku Hihan Yoko. I don't know if I'm saying that right. The edition received a high circulation of more than 57,000 copies. In his interpretation, Political Economy and Recognition of History, a Kiyoaki Hirata also uses the Grundrisse to analyze the spread of capitalism from the advanced Western states through the introduction of commodity production in the despotic states of Asia. 2 complete volumes are available in Italian by Enzo Grillo, 1968-1970, and by Hans-Georg Backhaus. Lucio Coletti had already translated the introduction in 1954, and following the logical school of Galvano della Volpe, highlighted the influence of Immanuel Kant and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel on Marx. The Grundrisse was considered a complete and classic masterpiece by the Operaismo movement. Antonio Negri stresses the importance of the Grundrisse for understanding postmodern post-Fordist capitalism. Marx's concept of the, quote, general intellect in the machine fragment gained great importance in the post-Operaism movement for an analysis of immaterial labor, cognitive capitalism, and the structure of abstract dominance, which leads to a biopolitical command through knowledge. The Grundrisse also played an influential role in the new reading of Marx. Interpreters such as Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, Gerhard Güler note a process of reduction of the dialectical and progressive popularization in the presentation of value form analysis through the first edition of Capital to the second edition of Capital, whereby Marx promoted historicizing and substantialist interpretations. Back to the text. I'm going to repeat the last line I read. In the Grundrisse, Marx elaborated the same theme. Quote, labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as a watchman and regulator to the production process itself. ... He steps to the side of the production process instead of being the production process's chief actor. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Modern technology would allow a revolutionary expansion of free time for the development of individuals whose knowledge and productive skills would be mediated into a concrete universal through the conscious plan. Marx, Grundrisse. See Marx, Grundrisse. The plan would permit mutual recognition by the associated producers of each individual's contribution to socially necessary labor. Marx believed that he had brought Hegel's dialectic to a positive rather than merely speculative conclusion by demonstrating that the laws of communal life must become transparent in the plan. The laws of economic planning would replace the Hegelian laws of ethical life, for each worker would acquire the knowledge to participate directly in planning, rather than relying upon Hegelian institutions of corporate mediation. Marx circumvented Hegel's political theory by adopting Hegel's own emphasis upon the universalizing activity of reason. The crucial difference was that Hegel took science to mean philosophical knowledge of the absolute, whereas Marx understood science as the activity of technical reason. For Hegel's exaltation of right, Marx substituted a system of economic claims, measured in terms of each individual's contribution of labor time to the social product. By revolutionizing productivity, however, communist society would both elevate and eliminate, or transcend, the claims or quote rights of all. Characterized by economic abundance, the higher stage of communism would enable each individual to draw upon the social product in accordance with his needs. There would be no need for particular rights, for as scarcity receded, each could spontaneously recognize the needs and rights of all. There would be no need for politics, for there would no longer be any particular claim to right which needed to be enforced by an apparatus of compulsion. There would be no need for a state, for the end of economic contingency would remove the need Hegel had seen to secure the personality through embodiment of the will and property. Marx completed his transformation of Hegelian dialectic in the sections of the Grundrisse, dealing with technology and scientific production. As the notebooks for Capital, which Marx never completed, the Grundrisse remained unpublished and was unknown to Trotsky's generation. Most Marxists learned what they did of Hegel and dialectics from Engels. In The Dialectics of Nature, Engels promised that illustrations from the natural science would make Hegel's logic, quote, simple and clear as noonday, end quote. Friedrich Engels, Dialectics of Nature. I'm going to read the German Wikipedia of Dialektik der Natur. Dialectics of Nature is Friedrich Engels' unfinished work on the philosophy of natural science, which presents the basic features of materialism in a critique of natural philosophy and the metaphysical ideas that are prevalent in the natural sciences of the mid-19th century. The manuscripts consist of a total of 4 bundles, which date from the years before and after the publication of Anti-Düring, of which nothing was published during Engels' lifetime. After his death, 2 articles from them appeared in journals. One was Part of the Work on the Humanization of the Apes, published in 1896, and Natural Research in the Spirit World, 1898. The Complete Dialectics of Nature was published for the first time in 1925 in the USSR in German, together with a Russian translation. Later editions in 1935 in the original language, in the Marx-Engels Complete Edition. Friedrich Engels, Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, Dialectics of Nature, 1873 to 1882, and a Russian edition in 1941, which was the model for further international editions. Sketch of the overall plan. 1. Historical introduction. In natural science, through natural science's own development, the metaphysical conception has become impossible. 2. Course of theoretical development in Germany since Hegel, old preface, return to dialectics takes place unconsciously, and is therefore contradictory and slow. 3. Dialectics is the science of the overall context, main laws, reversal of quantity and quality, mutual penetration of polar opposites, and reversal into one another when taken to the extreme, development through contradiction or negation of the negation, spiral form of development. 4. Connection between the sciences, mathematics, mechanics, physics, chemistry, biology, Saint-Simon, Comte, and Hegel. 5. A percus on the individual sciences and their dialectical content. 1. Mathematics, dialectical aids and turns of phrase, the mathematically infinite actually occurring. 2. Mechanics of the heavens, now resolved into a process. Mechanics, starting from inertia, which is only the negative expression of the indestructibility of motion. 3. Physics, transitions of molecular movements into each other, Clausius and Loschmidt. 4. Chemistry, theories, energy. 5. Biology, Darwinism, necessity, and randomness. 6. The limits of knowledge, Du Bois, Raymond, and Nageli. Helmholtz, Kant, Hume. 7. The mechanical theory, Hegel. 8. The plastidal soul, Hegel and Nageli. 9. Science and teaching, Virchow. 10. Cell state, Virchow. Darwinist politics and social theory, Hegel and Schmidt. Differentiation of man through work. Application of economics to natural science. Helmholtz's, quote, work, quote, popular lectures. Back to the text. In Dialectics of Nature, Engels promised that illustrations from the natural science would make Hegel's logic, quote, simple and clear as noonday, end quote. In reality, Engels obscured the relation between determinism and self-determination, a matter which Marx thought he had finally resolved. Engels argued that the Hegelian dialectic of consciousness, which Marx understood as an active relation of man to nature, was in fact a reflection of dialectical movement in the material world itself. In Anti-Dirting, Engels portrayed reason as nature's own evolutionary product. The, quote, products of the human brain, end quote, were simply, quote, products of nature, end quote. Engels, Anti-Dirting. The laws of thought did not contradict the laws of nature, but were in, quote, correspondence, end quote, with the laws of nature. The correspondence theory of consciousness was what Engels called, quote, pure materialism, end quote. I'm going to look up pure materialism. I'm not saying anything. Back to the text. Mind was brain, and brain was the, quote, highest product of matter, end quote. Engels. Anti-Dirting. Footnote. Hegel's philosophy of nature also saw a logical dialectic in the evolution of existent things, but this approach presupposed the ontology of the logic. End footnote. Whereas Hegel regarded nature as mind asleep, Engels regarded mind as nature awake. Engels helped to create confusion for an entire generation of Marxists. If the material world evolved of the material world's own accord and produced thought as a reflection of matter, how could thinking beings undertake to make the social world rational? That's a good question. If the material world evolved of the material world's own accord and produced thought as a reflection of matter, how could thinking beings undertake to make the social world rational? I'm going to look up Hegel's logic. Yeah, I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Hegel's logic. Sorry, Richard B. Day. I'm using your article as an opportunity to look up all these things. The Science of Logic is the main work of the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831, which was first published in Nuremberg between 1812 and 1816. Building on the phenomenology of spirit, the aim of the Science of Logic is to develop an ontological metaphysical logic that is linked to the ancient Logos philosophy. At the same time, it aims to be an ontotheology. The work is one of the most important philosophical writings of modern times, playing a role in the neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, philosophical hermeneutics, and dialectical materialism, among others. Many philosophers up to the present day have dealt intensively with its content, including Soren Kierkegaard, Bruno Leibrux, and Dieter Henrich. In logic, Hegel presupposes the, quote, scientific standpoint, end quote, gained in the phenomenology of spirit. This had shown that the logical determinations, categories, as in classical metaphysics, can neither be understood as mere determinations of a subject-independent reality, nor as mere determinations of the subject, as in Kant's philosophy. Rather, they must be understood from the unity of subject and object. The task of logic is to present pure thought in its specific meaning. It is intended to replace the classical disciplines of philosophy, logic, and metaphysics by uniting the two programs, the presentation of pure thought and the idea of the absolute. In Hegel's view, logical determinations also have an ontological character. They are not merely to be understood as contents of consciousness, but also as, quote, the interior of the world, end quote. Hegel. Hegel's aim is to carry out a systematic derivation of the categories and to demonstrate the category's necessity. The decisive means for this is the principle of dialectic, which Hegel sees as being based on the nature of logical determination itself. Hegel is therefore convinced that in this way all categories can be completely derived, quote, as a system of totality, end quote. The logic is divided into a, quote, objective logic, end quote, the doctrine of being and essence, and a, quote, subjective logic, end quote, the doctrine of the concept. Doctrine of being. Quality. For Hegel, logic must begin with a concept that is characterized by, quote, pure immediacy, end quote. This is expressed in the concept of being, which has no determinations whatsoever. But the renunciation of any further differentiation renders the definition of, quote, being completely empty of content. Thus, for being, the definition of, quote, nothing and no more or less than nothing, end quote, is at least obtained. Not, quote, less than nothing, end quote, means that this, quote, nothing, end quote, is at least a thought determination, something thought. Being and nothing therefore, quote, pass over, end quote, into one another. This, quote, passing over, end quote, of both into one another itself represents a new category, quote, becoming. In, quote, becoming, both determinations, quote, being, and, quote, nothing, are contained in their mutual passing over into one another. If we now think of being mediated by this unity of becoming, then the determination of the becoming being of, quote, Dasein, end quote, arises. Dasein's genesis, however, requires that the, quote, nothing, end quote, in it can also be recognized. From this perspective, quote, Dasein appears as a, quote, something that stands in opposition to the, quote, other. A something can only be grasped if it is distinguished from something else. According to the sentence of Spinoza quoted by Hegel, quote, omnis determinatio est negatio, end quote. Every determination is a negation. Every determination is a demarcation, whereby every boundary also includes something that exists beyond it. To think of a boundary as such also means to think of the limitless. Likewise, the idea of the, quote, finite is given along with that of the, quote, infinite. The infinite is the, quote, other of the finite, just as the finite is the, quote, other of the infinite. But for Hegel, the infinite cannot simply be contrasted with the finite. Otherwise, the infinite would, quote, border on the finite and would thus itself be limited and finite. The, quote, truly infinite, end quote, must rather be thought of as encompassing the finite. As the, quote, unity of the finite and the infinite, the unity which is itself the infinite, which encompasses itself and the finite within itself, end quote. Hegel does not want this unity to be understood in a pantheistic sense, since it is not a unity without differences, but one in which the infinite allows the finite to exist. Hegel calls this the, quote, true, or, quote, affirmative infinity, end quote. It differs from the, quote, bad infinity, end quote, which only comes through a mere progression from limit to limit in an infinite progress, which lacks the reference back through the beyond of the limit. This reference also characterizes the finite. It is the result of its mediation with the infinite and constitutes the, quote, being for itself, end quote, of the finite. From the category of, quote, being for itself, end quote, Hegel develops further definitions in the further course of the section on, quote, quality. If something is, quote, for itself, it is, quote, one. If this, quote, one is mediated by, quote, others, then these are also to be regarded as, quote, one. The, quote, one thus gives rise to the plurality of, quote, ones. They differ from one another, but are also related to one another, which Hegel calls, quote, repulsion and, quote, attraction. Their uniform plurality leads to the concept of, quote, quantity. Quantity. The crucial difference between quantity and quality is that when quantity is changed, the identity of what is changed remains. A thing remains what it is, whether it is made larger or smaller. Hegel distinguishes it between pure, indeterminate quantity, and determinate quantity, or quantum. Space is such as an instance of pure quantity. If, on the other hand, one speaks of a determinate space, then it is an instance of determinate quantity. The two concepts of, quote, attraction and, quote, repulsion, which are sublaid in the category of quantity, becomes here the moments of continuity and separation, discretion. These two concepts also presuppose each other. Continuity means that there is a continuously continuing, quote, something. This, quote, something is necessarily a, quote, something that is separated from, quote, another. Conversely, the concept of separation also presupposes that of continuity. One can only separate under the assumption that there is something that is not separated, and from which the separated is separated. A quantum is of a certain size that can always be expressed by a number. The concept of number therefore belongs to the category of quantum. A number has two moments. A number is defined as a number and as a unit. The concept of number as sum of units excludes the concept of separation, while the concept of unity excludes continuity. A quantum can be, quote, intensive or, quote, extensive quantity. An intensive quantity, e.g., color sensation, feeling of warmth, can be characterized using the term degree, a degree that has more or less intensity depending on the quantity. Extensive quantities, e.g., length or volume, have neither degree nor intensity. Extensive quantity is decided by means of an established scale. Intensive quantities, on the other hand, cannot be determined by any scale outside of them. The physicalist theory that every intensive quantity can be reduced to an extensive quantity is rejected by Hegel. Measure. The doctrine of measure is about the unity of quality and quantity. Hegel uses clear examples to explain the nature of this unity of quality and quantity. For example, the quantitative change in the temperature of water leads to a qualitative change in water's state. Water freezes or turns into steam. This creates the definition of an underlying, indifferent, quote, substrate, whose, quote, states change according to the proportions of measure. The idea of something that is differentiated in this way, according to, quote, substrate and, quote, states, leads to the second part of logic, the, quote, doctrine of essence. Doctrine of essence. The doctrine of essence is considered the most difficult part of logic and was modified several times by Hegel. Here, Hegel could not rely on the philosophical tradition to the same extent as in the other two books, the doctrine of being, the doctrine of the concept. The greatest influence was exerted by Kant's, quote, transcendental logic, whose theoretical elements, modal and relational categories, concepts of reflection and antinomies, Hegel attempted to derive in a conceptually consistent manner in a new context. The concept of essence. Hegel describes the concept of essence through the concept of, quote, memory, which Hegel understands in the literal sense as, quote, becoming inward, end quote, and, quote, going into oneself, end quote. It describes a sphere that lies deeper than the external immediacy of being, whose surface must first be, quote, pierced, in order to reach the essence. The logical determinations of essence are different from those of being. In contrast to the categories of the logic of being, they appear primarily in pairs and receive their determination from their relationship to their other, essential and inessential, identity and difference, positive and negative, reason and reasoned, form and matter, form and content, conditioned and unconditioned, etc. The contradiction. Hegel begins with a discussion of the, quote, determination of reflection, end quote, quote, identity, quote, difference, quote, contradiction, and, quote, ground. Hegel analyzes the determinations of reflection and their relationship to one another, and shows that they have no truth in isolation from one another. The most important determination of reflection is that of, quote, contradiction. Hegel attaches great importance to the fact that contradiction should not be, quote, pushed into subjective reflection, end quote, as Kant does. This would mean, quote, too much tenderness, end quote, towards things. Rather, contradiction belongs to the things themselves. It is, quote, the principle of all self-movement, end quote, and is therefore also present in all movement. The principle of contradiction does not apply to external movement, but is the fundamental principle of all living things. Quote, something is alive only insofar as that something contains contradictions within that thing's self, namely the power to grasp and endure contradiction within itself, end quote. Otherwise, that something, quote, perishes in the contradiction, end quote. This principle applies in particular to the sphere of thought. Quote, speculative thinking consists only in the fact that thought holds fast to contradictions, and in it to itself, end quote. For Hegel, contradiction is thus the structure of logical, natural, and spiritual reality in general. In the second section of the Logic of Essence, quote, the appearance, Hegel explicitly deals with Kant and the problem of the, quote, thing in itself, end quote. His intention is not only to eliminate the difference between, quote, thing in itself and, quote, appearance, but also to declare the, quote, appearance to be the truth of the, quote, thing in itself, end quote. Quote, the appearance is what the thing in itself is, or its truth, end quote. For Hegel, what something is in itself is revealed nowhere but in its appearance, and it is therefore pointless to build a realm of the, quote, in itself, quote, behind it. The, quote, appearance is the, quote, higher truth, against both the, quote, thing in itself and immediate existence, because it is the, quote, essential, whereas bracket, immediate, and bracket, existence is the still inessential appearance, end quote. Reality. In the third section, quote, reality, Hegel discusses central doctrines of the logic and metaphysical tradition, the logical and metaphysical tradition. A central theme is the debate with Spinoza's concept of the absolute. Hegel sees in the absolute, on the one hand, quote, all determination of essence and existence or of being in general, as well as of reflection dissolved, end quote. I'm going to repeat that. Quote, all determination of essence and existence or of being in general as well as of reflection dissolved, end quote. Since otherwise it could not be understood as the absolutely unconditional. But if it were thought of merely as the negation of all predicates, it would be merely emptiness, although it should be thought of as its opposite, namely as fullness in itself. But this absolute cannot be opposed by thinking as external reflection, because this would abolish the concept of the absolute. The interpretation of the absolute cannot therefore fall into a reflection external to it, but must rather be the absolute's own interpretation. Quote, in fact, however, the interpretation of the absolute is the absolute's own doing, and it begins with itself as the absolute arrives at itself. End quote. Doctrine of concept. The third book of the science of logic develops a logic of the, quote, concept, which is divided into three sections, quote, subjectivity, quote, objectivity, and, quote, idea. The subjectivity. In the section subjectivity, Hegel deals with the classical doctrine of concept, judgment, and conclusion. To explain the, quote, concept of the concept, end quote, Hegel recalls the, quote, nature of the ego, end quote. There's a structural analogy between the concept and the ego. Like the concept, the ego is, quote, a unity that refers to itself, and this not directly, but by abstracting from all determination and content, and returning to the freedom of unlimited equality with itself, end quote. Hegel's use of the term, quote, concept differs from what is usually understood by a concept. For Hegel, the concept is not an abstraction but ignores empirical content. The concept is not an abstraction that ignores empirical content. The concept is not an abstraction that ignores empirical content, but rather the concrete. An essential moment of the concept is the concept's, quote, negativity. Hegel rejects the concept of absolute identity underlying the usual understanding of concepts, since for Hegel the concept of identity necessarily includes the concept of difference. Hegel's, quote, concept has three moments: generality, particularity, parenthesis, separation, and parenthesis, and individuality, parenthesis, individuality. To negate means to determine and to limit. The result of the negation of the general is the separate, particularity, which as a result of the negation of this negation, i.e., the negation of the particularity, is identical with the general, since the particularity returns to the original unity and becomes individuality. For Hegel, the concept is the unity of the universal and the individual. This unity is explained in the judgment, S is P, where S is the subject and the individual, and P is the predicate, the universal. According to Hegel, a sentence can very well have the grammatical form of a judgment without being a judgment. For example, the sentence, quote, Aristotle died in the 73rd year of his age, in the 4th year of the 115th Olympiad, end quote, is not a judgment. Although it shows the syntax of the judgment, it does not connect a general concept with the individual, and thus does not meet the logical requirements of the judgment. Nevertheless, the above sentence can be a judgment, namely when the sentence is used in a situation in which one doubted in which year Aristotle died or how old he was, and the end of the doubt is expressed in the sentence discussed here. For Justus Hartnack, this means that Hegel, in fact, quote, without formulating it as such, introduces the analytical distinction between a sentence and its use. One of the same sentence can be used as an imperative, as a warning or threat, or as a request, etc. End quote. In the conclusion, a unity of judgment and concept takes place. Hegel considers the following example. 1. All people are mortal. 2. Now Cagis is a human. 3. Ergo Cagis is mortal. The particular concept, the particular here is, quote, people. The individual, the single, is Cagis. And the concept, quote, mortal, is the general. The result is a unity of the individual subject and the general or universal predicate, i.e., the predicate in the judgment, Cagis is mortal. The objectivity. For Hegel, the concept of the object can only be understood insofar as it has a necessary connection to the concept of the subject. In this respect, it is also the subject of the, quote, science of logic, end quote. Hegel's philosophical analysis leads step by step from a, quote, mechanical to a, quote, chemical to a, quote, teleological view of the object. In the teleological object, the process that led to the purpose and purpose itself, the process that led to the purpose and the purpose itself can no longer be distinguished from one another. In it, subjectivity objectifies itself. Hegel calls this unity of subjectivity and objectivity the idea. The idea. In the concept of the idea, all determinations of the logic of being in essence, as well as those of the logic of the concept, are, quote, sublated. The idea is true. It is thus identical with everything that the science of logic presents with regard to the logical structure of being. All categories are integrated in the idea. With it, the so-called movement of the concept ends. Hegel distinguishes three aspects of the idea: life, knowledge, and the absolute idea. In life, the idea can be understood as the unity of soul and body. It is the soul that makes an organism into an organism. The different parts of an organism are what those parts are solely because of those parts' relationship to the unity of the organism. In cognition of the true and the good, the knowing subject strives for knowledge about a given object. The object of cognition is both different from and identical with the subject. Finally, in the absolute idea, as the culmination of philosophical thought, consciousness sees the identity of the subjective and the objective, of the in itself and the for itself. The subject recognizes the subject self as an object, and the object is therefore the subject. In the secondary literature, three prominent currents can be distinguished: ontological, epistemological, and semantic readings. Ontological readings assume that Hegel's logic develops a theory without presuppositions by presenting the fundamental structure of reality. This undertaking is without presuppositions because the beginning of logic chooses a minimal starting point with, quote, absolute knowledge or, quote, pure being. The project of a logic is therefore characterized above all by being undogmatic and resistant to skepticism. The continuation of the investigation is also not carried out by a dogmatically assumed method, but should arise, quote, from the matter itself, end quote. Hegel's project is therefore explicitly not characterized by the presupposition of a so-called, quote, dialectical method, end quote, as was accused by Russell, for example. Representatives of this reading are, for example, Vittorio Husla, Stephen Holgate, and Herbert Marcuse. Epistemological readings see the science of logic as an undertaking in continuity with a Kantian project. Particularly crucial for the reception history of this interpretive trend is the book Hegel's Idealism, The Satisfactions of Self-Consciousness by Robert B. Pippin, published in 1989. Semantic readings can be divided into two variants, first level and higher level. According to first level semantic readings, logic presents categories that are inherent in our linguistic practice. Hegel's starting point is our everyday scientific and philosophical language. This includes the analysis of inferential connections of our use of concepts in these different linguistic practices. Representatives of this reading are Berto and Pinkard. In contrast, higher-level semantic readings understand logic as a meta-theory about first-level semantic projects. In his work, Perman Stekeler Weithofer, who has been particularly well received for this approach, understands logic as a, quote, general method of reflection on a conventional and practice, including the even higher level, quote, speculative reflection on the conditions of possibility of consciousness and critical thinking, end quote. Perman Stekeler Weithofer. Back to the text. New section. Trotsky and his contemporaries. Regarding social change as the central question of history, Leon Trotsky agreed with Engels to a point. Quote, the dialectical view of nature and humanity coincides with the so-called, quote, evolutionary, end quote, view of nature, end quote. That's from Trotsky and Trotsky's Notebooks, 1933, 1934, 35, edited and translated by Philip Pomper. But Trotsky also thought it was a mistake to confuse the science of social production with the science of nature. Trotsky commented that it would be, quote, completely naive and unscientific, to carry over the conclusions of biology to society, end quote. Trotsky. 1933 to 1935 Notebooks. It was true that materialism took being to be the premise of thought, and thought certainly could not, quote, liberate matter from matter's materiality, end quote. Trotsky's Notebooks, 1933 to 1935. However, the real question was whether materiality exercised dominion over consciousness. Here Trotsky differed from Engels by insisting that the laws of thought or logic express the laws of consciousness, quote, in its active relationship to the external world, end quote. Trotsky. Notebooks, 1933 to 1935. Just so you know, so I don't have to keep saying it, all these subsequent quotes are from Trotsky's Notebooks, 1933 to 1935, until I say otherwise. Where the hell am I? However, the real question was whether materiality exercised dominion over consciousness. Here Trotsky differed from Engels by insisting that the laws of thought or logic express the laws of consciousness, quote, in its active relation to the external world, end quote. The prevalent theme of Trotsky's notebooks on dialectics was that, quote, dialectical cognition is not identical with the dialectic of nature, end quote. Instead, dialectical cognition is, quote, a result of the lively interaction between consciousness and nature, end quote. Trotsky. In Trotsky's view, the development of being compelled thought to adjust thought's conceptual grasp, and thus confirmed Hegel's exposure of the, quote, failure of static thinking, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky considered revolutionary theory to be one-sided and, quote, less concrete, end quote, than dialectics because, I think I said that wrong. Trotsky considered evolutionary, like as in Darwin, theory to be one-sided and, quote, less concrete, end quote, than dialectics because it failed to incorporate consciousness as a, quote, specialized part of the objective world, end quote. Trotsky. I should say that when I said evolutionary in the sense of Darwin, I meant that I was saying evolutionary and not revolutionary with an R. History could only be comprehended by recognizing humanity's imprint. As Trotsky declared, quote, the psyche arising from matter is, quote, freed, end quote, from the determination of matter so that it can independently, by its laws, influence matter, end quote. Human consciousness always played, quote, an autonomous, that is, within certain limits, and independent role in the life of the individual and the species, end quote. Trotsky. If consciousness did not play such a role, then, said Trotsky, quote, it is unnecessary, useless. It is harmful because it is a superfluous complication, and what a complication, end quote. Trotsky. For Trotsky, the distinguishing role of thought in history was thought's pursuit of, quote, certain practical outcomes, end quote. It was impossible to speak of historical causality without acknowledging teleology, or purpose as, quote, a partial aspect of the cause, end quote. Trotsky. Determinism, as a theory of objective causality, denied the salience of human intervention. Pure materialism and objective determinism suggested the impossibility of political practice, whereas Trotsky believed it was precisely through political life that quantitative social change became qualitative. Human history did not happen. Human history was made, and politics grew up out of economics for the purpose of reconstructing economic relations. Quote, living people, end quote, used political institutions as superstructural, quote, levers, end quote, to impose their own subjective ends upon the objective world. Trotsky's philosophical differences with the tradition stemming from Engels distinguished Trotsky clearly from the mainstream of Bolshevik thought. Those Bolsheviks who did not absorb Engels' views directly picked Engels' views up indirectly through Lenin's early writings. In Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin declared that, quote, the mastery of nature, manifested in human practice, is a result of an objectively correct reflection within the human head of the phenomena and the process of nature, end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Lenin followed Engels in the view that practice referred to experimental science and successful utilization of natural laws, which operate, quote, independently of our will and mind, end quote. Scientific knowledge required a strictly, quote, objective criterion of truth, end quote. Only in his later philosophical notebooks did Lenin turn to Hegel directly, and here his conclusions were strikingly similar to Trotsky's. Quote, man's consciousness, end quote, Lenin wrote, quote, not only reflects the objective world but creates it, end quote. When the world does not satisfy man, man, quote, decides to change the world by his activity, end quote. Lenin. Lenin's notes on Hegel, which were published only posthumously, created, quote, cognition and, quote, will as the two sides of, quote, practical activity, which abolishes the, quote, one-sidedness of both subjectivity and objectivity, end quote. Lenin. Following his rediscovery of Hegel, Lenin became convinced that, quote, it is impossible to understand Marx's Capital, without having thoroughly understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, none of the Marxists understood Marx, exclamation point, end quote. Lenin. Nikolai Bukharin was one of those who, according to Lenin, had neither studied nor fully understood dialectics. Bukharin's most comprehensive treatment of dialectics came in his book Historical Materialism, A System of Sociology. Where am I? I'm looking up to see if there's anything for this Bukharin piece. No. Nature and society alike were said to be governed by, quote, natural law and objective causality. There was, quote, no difference at all, ... between the social sciences and the sciences concerned with nature, end quote. For man was merely, quote, a portion of nature, end quote. Matter was the, quote, mother of mind, end quote. Bukharin. Human society was, quote, a product of nature, end quote. Bukharin. The phenomena of consciousness were, quote, a property of matter organized in a certain manner, a, quote, function, end quote, of such matter, end quote. Bukharin. The final degeneration of Marxism came with Stalin, who plumbed the depths of silliness and cynicism simultaneously. Stalin too thought, quote, mind is secondary derivative, since it is a reflection of matter, a reflection of being, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Look that up. I'm not seeing anything good. In Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, the book by Stalin, Stalin turned directly to the question of how consciousness might transform the world if, at the same time, it is merely a reflection of what is. Stalin argued that the laws of political economy, like those of nature, quote, operated independently of the will of man, end quote. Stalin, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Sorry, back to the text. I was trying to look up that Stalin book, but I'm not finding any good explanations of it. Stalin argued that the laws of political economy, like those of nature, quote, operate independently of the will of man, end quote. Stalin. But Stalin also declared that, quote, man can discover laws and get to know and master them, end quote. Stalin. What Stalin meant was that economic laws operate independently of the will of workers, economic laws operate independently of the will of workers as objects of the plan, but are discovered and mastered by bureaucrats who fancy themselves to be the universal subjects of history. From Hegel's philosophy of right and Marx's critique of universal bureaucracy, we have now journeyed to Stalin's metaphysics of bureaucratic planning. The remaining task is to clarify how Trotsky's philosophical differences with Stalinism shaped Trotsky's reflection on the possibility of restoring socialist democracy. During the years of war communism and civil war, Neither Trotsky nor any other Bolshevik leader attached high priority to democracy. In 1920, the Bolshevik Revolution hung by a thread, and Trotsky's preliminary thoughts on economic planning emphasized, quote, unity of will, unity of direction, unity of action, end quote, achieved through the mobilization and militarization of labor. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, Terrorism and Communism, a reply to Karl Kautsky. Beginning in 1923, however, with Trotsky's articles on the, quote, new course, Trotsky increasingly spoke of, quote, democracy and, quote, centralism as two aspects of party leadership which had to be reconciled through, quote, organizational self-determination, end quote, at all levels. Trotsky, the new course. See Trotsky's The New Course. In 1926, Trotsky referred to, quote, vigilant control, end quote, by workers and the, quote, collective control, end quote, of public opinion as necessary safeguards against bureaucratic arbitrariness. Socialism could not be built by administrative orders from above, but only through the, quote, greatest initiative, individual activity, persistence, and resilience of the opinion and will of the many-millioned masses, who sense and know the affair to be their own business, who never hope that someone will do the job for them, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky anticipated the revolution's bureaucratic degeneration in the 1920s, but he only addressed the problem comprehensively in The Revolution Betrayed, which was written in 1936 and appeared at the height of Stalin's purge trials. By this time, the bureaucracy had emerged and consolidated itself as, quote, an uncontrolled caste alien to socialism, end quote. In his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx had criticized Hegel's alleged, quote, separation of the political state from civil society, end quote. Trotsky likewise claimed that the Stalinist bureaucracy protected the Stalinist bureaucracy's monopoly of power through, quote, separation between the state and society, end quote. Trotsky, Revolution Betrayed. The bureaucracy controlled society, but society had no presence in political life. Stalinist planners claimed to be the, quote, universal mind, end quote, of society. In fact, they had transformed the state from Hegel's ethical universal into a, quote, universal merchant, creditor, and industrialist, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. The means of production supposedly belonged to the state, but the state, Trotsky charged, quote, belongs, end quote, to the bureaucracy, end quote. It's important that Trotsky puts belongs in quotation marks. Marx's philosophical commitment to the totality of reason had been distorted and manipulated to rationalize a regime which was in fact, quote, totalitarian, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Marx's philosophical commitment to the totality of reason had been distorted and manipulated to rationalize a regime that was in fact, quote, totalitarian, end quote. Trotsky saw the principal cause of degeneration and economic backwardness. Forced industrialization had universalized the social division of labor and stratified society into workers and commanders. The need to overcome backwardness resulted in privilege for those groups, quote, whose existence was necessary for defense, for industry, for technique, and science, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. The need for incentives had developed into a, quote, cult of bureaucracy, of officialdom, and aristocracy of technique, end quote. Trotsky. These hierarchical inequalities found their horizontal counterpart in what Trotsky termed the, quote, struggle of each against all, end quote. Trotsky. Emphasizing heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods, the planners had caused social solidarity to collapse into a universal, quote, struggle for individual existence, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Expanded reproduction of economic scarcity drove peasants and workers alike to display complete indifference to nominally socialist property. Destruction of the ruble through inflation meant that, quote, graft and speculation, end quote, became universal, and social mediation occurred through criminality, favoritism, and parasitism. Through its own miscalculations, the plan simultaneously produced the plan's opposite in the black market, without which the plan could not function. Ex ante planning errors required ex post mediation through anarchic market forces. The secret of bureaucratic rule was, quote, the poverty of society and objects of consumption, end quote. The result of which was to shatter social solidarity and disorganize any resistance to exploitation. As a Marxist dialectician, however, Trotsky believed that a higher universal would result from the sundering of an original unity into its parts. The traditional society of Russia had been fragmented by the 5-year plans, with millions of raw recruits being drafted from one self-sufficient village from the once self-sufficient village into new industries. The central issue is how these atomized social relations might be politically reconstituted, how the people might actively reorganize social relations of production through the use of political, quote, levers. The social antagonisms of Stalinism convinced Trotsky that, quote, a stifled but passionate political struggle is being waged throughout the country, end quote. Believing that politics grew out of economics, Trotsky regarded the economic struggle as implicitly political, and economic necessity providing an objective basis for self-conscious organization of the workers. Trotsky saw the link between the economic struggle and political action in the ruble. A technically coherent plan was inconceivable without a stable currency for accounting. The labor market similarly required currency stabilization in order to provide real incentives. The bureaucracy would be compelled to recognize that its own fate was tied to that of the ruble. To restore the ruble, however, was to create an instrument of control from below. The contradictions of planning necessarily reproduced the market, in which the ruble had the capacity to serve as, quote, an instrument for the influence of the population upon economic plans, end quote. In a socialist market with a real currency, the movement of prices might replace administrative determinations of needs with popular self-expression. In a country that had been politically strangled, everyday relations of production and exchange could become, quote, an important lever for the mobilization of opposition forces, end quote. Trotsky. Marx had seen the transparent reason of communal life articulated in the plan. Trotsky expected that economic struggle would render transparent the social contradictions of Stalinist exploitation. Quote, money accounting, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, cannot fail to give a more open character to the struggle of different strata for the distribution of national income. The question of the wage scale, is now decisive for the workers, and with it the question of the trade unions, end quote. Confident that the struggle over income shares, quote, necessarily becomes a political struggle, end quote, Trotsky predicted that Soviet workers would inevitably raise the demand for greater trade union autonomy. Quote, the designation of trade union officials from above is destined to meet more and more resistance, end quote. Trotsky. Stalinism could not sustain itself without a, quote, politically atomized society, end quote. Trotsky Opposition Bulletin. But if workers succeeded in imposing their economic demands, workers would mitigate the immediacy of needs and free their thought for, quote, general problems of politics, end quote. The dialectical reemergence of socialist democracy would begin with control from below, from the shop floor and the objective contradictions of bureaucratic administration. Addressing problems which Marx never anticipated, Trotsky intuitively found his way, through Marx's dialectic, back to Hegelian concerns. Like Hegel, Trotsky believed that freedom would be no more than a hollow abstraction until concretely institutionalized. This meant that Soviet trade unions could not remain apart from political processes. In a manner similar to Marx's treatment of corporations, Trotsky concluded that workers' organizations must become, quote, an important corrective in the Soviet state system, end quote. The state and the unions represented a unity of opposites wherein the state apparatus would wither away or undergo, quote, destatification, end quote, in the same measure as society raised its own institutions to universality through, quote, statification, end quote, of the unions. In the philosophy of right, Hegel had spoken of a coalescence of rights and duties, quote, right and duty coalesce, and by being in an ethical order, a man has rights insofar as a man has duties, and duties insofar as a man has rights, end quote. Hegel, philosophy of right. Trotsky took a similar view when Trotsky spoke of the quote, coalescence, end quote, of trade unions and the state. Footnote: Trotsky first used the term, quote, coalescence in the trade union debate of 1920. The two aspects of, quote, coalescence were, quote, statification of the unions and the, quote, workerization, end quote, of the state. End footnote. Unions had duties to the state insofar as unions had the right to participate in deliberations. The Stalinist separation of state and society would have to be transcended by having workers' representatives, like Hegel's corporate deputies, participating in authoring the plan. At the same time, the state, being socialized from below, must appoint its own representatives to responsible trade union bodies. In this mutual interpenetration of state and society, Trotsky saw the hope of making socialist democracy into a concrete universal. Where Trotsky differed from Marx was in his unique awareness of the political needs of a transitional society. The division of labor's social implications, aggravated by economic backwardness, inescapably dictated the struggle for recognition of particular needs, or what Hegel had called, quote, rights. Like Marx, Trotsky hoped the introduction of new technologies, of, quote, delicate mechanisms which demand both technical and general culture, end quote, would help to extend the conscious horizons of Soviet citizens. But determination of new goals and social values was also an inherently political process. Marxism had always promised, quote, to subordinate nature to technique and technique to plan, end quote. However, the practical dimension of socialist freedom also demanded a, quote, free conflict of ideas, end quote. A plurality of political parties was needed in order that political self-education might replace, quote, humiliating control, end quote, from above with self-imposed, quote, cultural discipline, end quote, growing out of, quote, education, habit, and social opinion, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's critique of Stalinism sought to preserve the emancipatory promise of Marxism by reinstating a Hegelian respect for the dignity of political life. Trotsky believed that socialist political life, arising from the system of needs, would promote the awakening of personality in the realm of, quote, the realm of spiritual culture. Political self-determination was necessary for the emergence of a higher consciousness. For, quote, critical views, the development of one's own opinion, the cultivation of personal dignity, end quote. Trotsky. New section, Jürgen Habermas. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Jürgen Habermas. It's a little long, but hey, why not? Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher and sociologist. Jürgen Habermas belongs to the second generation of the Frankfurt School and was most recently a professor of philosophy at the University of Frankfurt am Main. Habermas is one of the world's most widely read contemporary philosophers and sociologists. Habermas became known in the academic world through his work on social philosophy, with contributions to discourse, action, and rationality theory, with which Habermas advanced critical theory on a new basis, or Habermas communicative interactions, in which rational reasons for validity are raised and recognized, form the basis of the coordination of actions of socialized individuals, whose scope for action is determined in the dualism of system and life world. In addition to subject-specific discourses, Habermas was publicly involved in current political debates about eugenics, religion, the European Constitution, the role of fundamental rights in the state of emergency of state pandemic measures, and German government action regarding arms deliveries to the Ukrainian war zone. You know what? I actually don't think I'm going to read this entire thing. It's way too long for the purposes of this video. But if a book by Habermas comes up or a specific concept, I'm going to read that one. Okay. Jürgen Habermas would certainly endorse Trotsky's call for a free and responsible discussion of public affairs. Habermas's work begins, however, the conviction that both the Hegelian philosophy of consciousness and its Marxist reinterpretations have exhausted their capacity to explain the contradictions of modernity. The philosophy of consciousness is conceptually oriented upon a single world, within which human subjects can knowingly appropriate their creations. Habermas believes that we live conceptually in three worlds: the objective world of nature, the social world of relations with others, and the world of personal subjectivity to which each of us alone has direct access. The question then becomes, how can these three worlds be linked in meaning? Habermas believes they are linked neither by Hegelian reason nor by Marx's labor process, but primarily through the dialogue of everyday life. Habermas argues that, quote, reaching understanding is the inherent telos of human speech, end quote. Habermas. The theory of communicative action. Sorry. I'm going to look this book up. Sorry. The theory of communicative action, the main work of Jürgen Habermas, addresses the practical and theory-critical significance of communicative action for the social life of (post) and modern society. First published in 1981, the work begins with mythical worldviews, problematizes the understanding of meaning, and following Max Weber, examines forms of rationalization. With strong references to Talcott Parsons and Niklas Luhmann, it contains a validity-critical interpretation of modern communication theory. With multiple references to Immanuel Kant, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, it explains the founding function of communicative reason, and thus puts forward a thesis for the theoretical solution not only of questions of truth and veracity, but also of normative questions of justice. Because of its connection to critical theory, the Marxist tradition is also reflected on its contribution, in particular the theory of value, the critique of instrumental reason, and concepts such as reification and abstraction. Since the 1980s, the book has been regarded both in the press and in the wider specialist literature as Habermas's, quote, main work. It consists of 2 volumes. Volume 1, Action, Rationality, and Social Rationalization, which has 4 parts. Part 1, Introduction, Approaches to the Problem of Rationality. Part 2, Max Weber's Theory of Rationalization. 3, First Interim Considerations, Social Action, Purposeful Activity, and Communication. 4, From Lukács to Adorno, Rationalization is Reification. Volume 2, On the Critique of Functionalist Reason, also has 4 parts. Part 5, The Paradigm Shift in Mead and Durkheim, From Purposeful Activity to Communicative Action. 6, Second Interim Consideration, System and Life World. 4, Talcott Parsons, Construction Problems of Social Theory. 8, Conclusion, From Parsons to Weber and Marx. Terms: communicative action. The title of the work provides an operative and emphatically linguistic basic concept. Quote, the basic concept of communicative action provides access to 3 thematic complexes that are intertwined with one another: the concept of communicative rationality, a 2-stage social concept that links the paradigms of action and system, and a theoretical approach that explains the paradoxes of modernity with the help of a subordination of the communicatively structured life world to the imperative, independent, formally organized action systems. End quote. Habermas, Theory of Communicative Action. Modern society. For Habermas, communicative action is fundamental for the material and cultural symbolic reproduction of all societies, which are able to be understood as systems or as life worlds. In modern times, action systems are differentiated across different life worlds. In this context, quote, pathologies of the life world, end quote, cannot be avoided, which are coordinated and treated by communicative rationality, for example, in the economy and bureaucracy. This overall draft of a social theory, to which Niklas Luhmann created a communicative-oriented counterdraft 3 years later with the book Social Systems, published in 1984, is one of the large modern overall drafts for the systematic understanding of postmodern society dealt with in the theory of communicative action. Theoretical core. According to Habermas, quote, communicative action is a type of action that allows actions between interlocutors to be coordinated. In Habermas's opinion, the normative foundations of society lie in language, which as a means of interpersonal communication makes social interaction possible. Through communication, actors attempt to relate to one another in a way that is geared towards mutual understanding, with people who are capable of speaking and acting, coordinating their actions. The communicative rationality assumed in language forms the basis of social action. According to Habermas, understanding is only achieved when every listener can agree with all the validity claims of a statement. Otherwise, the validity claims must then be clarified in discourse. According to Habermas, quote, According to Habermas, there are 4 validity claims that must be fulfilled, each of which concerns 4 types of action, when influencing the other person, the level of purposive, rational action is affected. What is required is the validity of objective truth, because the reference point is the quote objective world, the world of evidence with its laws. The alleged facts must be correct. Norm-regulated action, in turn, refers to the world of the human community in which cultural values are transmitted. The social world, solidarity world statements in this regard must meet the claim of normative correctness. What is said must be in line with recognized values and norms. The claim to truthfulness is of a subjective nature, embedded in the dramatic action of self-staging. It is required that the respective speaker is honest. Communicative action serves to ensure comprehensibility. The meaning of a statement must be understood by all conversation partners. Habermas derives the validity claims from his universal pragmatics. According to Habermas, the results of non-authoritarian communication that come about solely by invoking these validity claims are optimally rational. For Habermas, these four validity claims correspond and overlap with the concept of intersubjective truth. However, intersubjective truth means that every theoretically possible discourse participant could agree with the statement, proposition. The optimal discourse is reflected in the ideal speech act situation. The speech act situation would be ideal if there was no distortion of communication. That is, 1. Equal opportunities for dialogue, initiation, and participation. 2. Equal opportunities for interpretation and argumentation quality. 3. Freedom from domination, as well as 4. No deception of speech intentions. To put it simply, a statement corresponds to communicative action if it is understandable, true, truthful, and correct. If doubts remain, the statement must be clarified in discourse. These transcendentally pragmatic conditions enable understanding and reasonable discourse. Habermas knows that the ideal speech act situation does not exist in reality. However, Habermas argues that we must at least implicitly undertake this idealization before any discourse. Only in this way can the quote peculiarly unforced force of the better argument end quote come about. Communicative action then arises from this communicative reason and organization of actions. With this approach, Habermas responds to two predecessors, Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Habermas, too, offers a theory with the claim of a critical theory to justify normativity, but is intended to refute the latter's pessimistic conclusion that man has not managed to build a world worthy of human beings using his reason, which is why reason is a blunt sword. Although, according to Habermas, the individual is not naturally gifted with reason, Habermas sees communication between people, particularly in the form of language, as a possible source of reason. However, communication only works if communication organizes its processes in a reason-oriented manner. This in turn means that the participants in the speech act must refrain from trying to achieve effects in the sense of perlocutory speech acts as long as what they communicate is to remain justifiable and criticizable. Habermas further analyzes the fundamental communication of society using the social psychological categories of George Herbert Mead, social behaviorism, in which Habermas recognizes a linguistic foundation, from sign language to symbolic interaction, and with regard to the achievement of an integrative religion and value orientation, authority of the sacred, according to Emile Durkheim. Religion and worldviews are conveyed via a collective consciousness. It is only in modern times that the individual can say no to this, but society still needs a binding morality. The passing on of binding norms must happen differently. In the process, the religious community of faith is transformed into a, quote, communication community under pressure to cooperate, end quote, and a, quote, verbalization of the sacred, end quote, takes place. The increasing rationalization is accompanied by a, quote, colonization of the life world, end quote, which penetrates tribal society like a colonial master. Habermas distinguishes the communicatively structured, quote, life world of the individual and his small social networks from the, quote, system, the bureaucratic apparatus of the state and economy, in which instrumental and strategic action, quote, functional rationality, end quote, always takes priority. The system penetrates the life world more and more through the services it offers to individuals, consumer society. Through bureaucratic constraints and through processes of legalization, leaving individuals only with the roles of consumers and clients of state and other services. Tasks of a critical theory. In the last chapter of Volume 2, Habermas sets out the central tasks of a contemporary critical, quote, theory of capitalist modernization, end quote. On the basis of his theory, it criticizes social reality with regard to unexploited available learning potential and an uncontrolled increase in complexity with destructive potential. At the same time, it criticizes social science approaches that examine complex social systems only from a reduced abstraction perspective without considering the historical constitution of the subject area. Habermas names 3 relevant current research areas: social history based on structural differentiation, systems science and economics and administrative science as a systems theory of society, Niklas Luhmann, and the theory of everyday life as anthropological field research, with an interest in the history of suffering of those who have had to pay the price for modern society, the collapse of tradition and ways of life. In this way, Habermas follows the older critical theory and its historical materialism, but dispenses with the teleological, i.e. Marxist, quote, historical philosophical ballast, end quote, Habermas. The relevant phenomena of modern post-liberal societies are a. their economic and general control crises, which results in the overexploitation of culture and human personality. B. the structural change of the family and the change in adolescence, psychological crises. C. the mass media and mass culture with an ambivalent authoritarian and at the same time emancipatory potential. And finally, D. the protest potential beyond distribution problems of the older kind, especially the commitment to alternative forms of life and against a system-oriented, quote, colonization of the life world, end quote. Specifically, these are, quote, green problems, damage to civilization, problems of overcomplexity, uncontrollable variables such as nuclear waste, genetic manipulation, comprehensive data storage, overloads of the communicative infrastructure, reaction expressed in, quote, psycho movement, end quote, religious fundamentalism, alternative projects with subculturally shielded communities. Criticism. Various critics accuse the theory of commutative action of being based on false basic assumptions, of being inadequate in terms of communication theory, and not being able to be implemented in practice. The first sustained criticism, which also articulates the strengths of the theory of communicative action, was made by Herbert Schnedelbach in 1982. Several experts refer to as, quote, critique advanced, end quote. Although one is still referred to the communicative rationality demonstrated by the book Theory of Communicative Action, the preceptions of those who describe and evaluate reasons prevent an internally derivable connection, so that even for answers to, quote, practical questions, end quote, found through argumentative consensus, a, quote, a priori that can never be fully objectified, end quote, remains. Niklas Luhmann, on the other hand, sees neither rationality nor human actions as being suitable for grasping the decisive processes of society. Without questioning the communicative paradigm, Luhmann and Schnedelbach have in common that their criticism relativizes Habermas's concern for normative justifiability. Other protagonists with further relativizations were Hans Albert, Karl Otto Appel, and Jean-François Lyotard. The work was honored, among other things, with the Kyoto Prize and Holberg Prize, which Jürgen Habermas accepted It influenced theoretical discussions worldwide. It has been translated, commented on, and criticized in numerous languages. Influential changes and further developments of Habermas's main work include his Moral Consciousness and Communicative Action, published in 1983, Factuality and Validity, Contributions to the Discourse Theory of Law and the Democratic Constitutional State, published in 1992, and Communicative Action and Detranscendentalized Reason. Okay, so back to the text, end footnote. Habermas argues that, quote, reaching understanding is the inherent telos of human speech, end quote. When a speaker orients himself to reaching understanding with another, his speech act necessarily raises three validity claims. He asserts that his statement is true, that he had the normative right to make his statement, and that he is sincerely expressing his personal intentions. The three validity claims refer to the objective, social, and subjective worlds. Speech acts acquire binding and bonding force when participants in a dialogue mutually expect that their validity claims can, if necessary, be discursively redeemed. Whereas Hegel and Marx spoke of the universality of reason, Habermas believes that rationality refers to the behavior of speaking and acting subjects who are capable of giving, quote, good reasons, end quote. Habermas. People coordinate their actions when they relate them to reasons that are mutually acceptable. When a validity claim is contested, the only court of rational appeal is argumentation, which ideally excludes, quote, all force, except the force of the better argument, end quote. Habermas. The dialogue of everyday life can clarify problematic situations, but Habermas does not believe it can ever yield the kind of transparency associated with the thought of Hegel or Marx. Language and culture are symbolic interpretations rather than transparent revelation of truth. They define a group's horizon, or what Habermas calls the life world of communicatively shared understanding. The life world is a cultural inventory of pre-reflective patterns of interpretation in the form of, quote, taken for granted background assumptions and naively mastered skills, end quote. Habermas. Unless we share with, quote, unshaken convictions, unless we share such, quote, unshaken convictions, end quote, it is impossible to give each other good reasons or to recognize each other as reasonable beings. Habermas finds the closest empirical reference for the life world as a total concept in archaic communities. Unlike Hegel and Marx, Habermas associates the ideal of universality with a state of cultural backwardness, in which the, quote, nearly total, end quote, institution of kinship, quote, reproduces itself as a whole in every single interaction, end quote. Habermas. The, quote, totalizing power of the, quote, savage, end quote, mind, end quote, generates an equally total worldview, weaving nature and culture into a, quote, single network of correspondences, end quote. Habermas. This abstract universality is overcome when the process of modernization rationalizes the life world through internal differentiation. Culture becomes distinguished from the magical and ritualized control of contingency. The social domain of interaction is differentiated from relations contingent upon birth, and individuated personalities emerge that are capable of maintaining their integrity in the face of a proliferation of social roles. Habermas's account of the rationalization of life worlds is reminiscent of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Structural differentiation of the life world causes some relaxation of its prejudgmental powers, allowing individual actors increasingly to negotiate mutual understanding through their own interpretive accomplishments. In this way, Habermas provides an internal perspective on the emergence of institutionalized discourses on science, law, and art, linked respectively to the objective social and subjective worlds. But as in Hegel's philosophy of right, where the idea went out of itself to create a world of social institutions, Habermas also sees a historical process of externalization. The community expands its power to act upon the world instrumentally, by separating out from the life world the system of state and economy. In a world of increasingly complex social relations, it is impossible to share every intention discursively. Instead, the political and economic systems mediate individual actions through power and money. At the same time, however, there is a danger that state and economy will congeal into the quote, second nature, end quote, of a norm-free sociality that can appear as an objectified context of life, end quote. Habermas. The life world becomes rationalized, enabling speakers to coordinate their actions through rational consensus, but they are now also situated within systems that are functionally rather than consensually integrated. The systematic organizations of modernity tend to become self-steering mechanisms, detached from normative constraints. The result is that systematically steered interactions are deprived of meaning. The fundamental contradiction of modernity is between life world and system, and between communicative competence and the objectivating effects of systems. The quote, dialectical concept of totality, end quote, therefore collapses into its quote, disjecta membra, end quote. Well, see what that word means. Wikipedia says disjecta membra, also written as disjecta membra, is Latin for, quote, scattered fragments, end quote. Also scattered limbs, members, or remains. And it is also used to refer to surviving fragments of ancient poetry, manuscripts, and other literary or cultural objects, including even fragments of ancient pottery. It is derived from disjecti membra poetae, a phrase used by Horace, a Roman poet. Back to the text. Human consciousness is split, and the moments of reason disintegrate. Hegel's political economy and Marx's consensual plan were intended to bring the autonomous process of economic growth back into the life world of mutual understanding. Habermas replies that system differentiation is a necessary response to the complex interactions of modernity. At the same time, Habermas shares Marx's fear of systemic dehumanization. Social systems tend to become domains of action detached from, quote, good reasons, end quote. The philosophical ideal of transparency and universal freedom gives way to the threat of opacity and systemic bondage. Developing in accordance with functional imperatives, systems undertake, quote, colonization of the life world. Systemic coordination economizes time and reduces the risk of misunderstanding in dialogue. It also reduces human beings to objects. Problematic situations in the life world are transformed through, quote, violent abstraction into legal, quote, situation definitions, whereby people are objectified as, quote, cases, and dealt with by technicians and bureaucrats. Formal law is produced through a technical discourse of jurisprudence, in the same way as science and the arts become the cultures and discourses of experts. Separation of these expert cultures reinforces cultural impoverishment of the life world. The more everyday life is technically administered rather than communicatively coordinated, the more meaningless it becomes. The domain of intersubjectivity contracts. Quote, everyday consciousness is robbed of everyday consciousness's power to synthesize. Everyday consciousness becomes fragmented. Everyday consciousness becomes fragmented, end quote. Habermas. Thus, modernity confronts us with exactly the concerns that motivated Hegel and Marx. Quote, 1. Whether a reason that has been objectively split up into that reason's moments can still preserve that reason's unity, and 2. How expert cultures can be mediated with everyday practice, end quote. The most urgent challenge continues to be, quote, mediation of the moments of reason, end quote. Habermas. Habermas believes that the link between theory and norm-based practice, as Hegel argued, lies in the law, for it inescapably joins systems and the life world. The law is both a demoralized means of organizing media-controlled systems and an expression of the normative convictions of human subjects. The dual character of the law means that functional organization is ultimately dependent upon practical justification of the legal order as a whole. Otherwise, political and economic systems will, quote, appear in the end as wanting legitimation, end quote. Habermas. The laws are similar to speech acts. The laws make validity claims which must be discursively redeemed. The, quote, violent abstraction, end quote, of modernity results from failure to achieve balanced institutionalization of discourses. Practical discourse has been suppressed in a state system that replaces communication with diffuse propaganda, to the extent that it restricts public dialogue in the name of technical expediency. The modern state inevitably provokes either resistance or anomic indifference. The pathologies induced by abstract power can be remedied only by the broadest opportunities for discursive formation of political will. Habermas believes, however, that universal discourse will remain an unattainable ideal. When Habermas speaks of the, quote, perspective of reconciliation and freedom, end quote, Habermas clearly describes it as, quote, utopian. The universality which Hegel and Marx had in mind is impossible to realize. Modern societies can no more fully internalize media-steered systems than modern societies can return to kinship organizations and the, quote, totalizing power of the, quote, savage, end quote, mind, end quote. At the same time, the struggle for shared meaning can never end. It is, quote, built into the linguistic mechanism of the reproduction of the species, end quote. Habermas. Culture, society, and personality are reproduced through communicative action. They cannot be manufactured according to a plan. Conclusion. Final section. If the debates of Soviet Marxists are now reinterpreted retrospectively through the Habermasian theory of communicative action, much of what has been said in this chapter can be stated rather differently. The debate over objective determinism can now be regained, not simply as a philosophical degeneration, but also as an insight into the contradictions of modern life. From this perspective, reduction of human consciousness to nature by Bukharin and Stalin becomes an ideological reflection of reality, insofar as modern systems do act with the impersonality of natural forces and do demand adaptation of consciousness to their own functional imperatives. Stalinist bureaucratic socialism can be reinterpreted as the planned imposition of administrative mechanisms of system coordination. The planning system in Habermasian terms was, quote, draped out as the life world, end quote, a domain of mutual recognition and understanding, whereas in reality public life became meaningless. Stalinism attempted to mass-produce meaning, but this, quote, shamming of communicative relations, end quote, did nothing to repair the fragmentation of public consciousness upon which bureaucratic administration depended. Leon Trotsky saw this fragmentation of public consciousness for what it was, a Hobbesian, quote, struggle of each against all, end quote, in a politically atomized society. Where am I? What Trotsky referred to as, quote, separation between the state and society, end quote, can now be reinterpreted as the uncoupling of modern industrial and administrative systems from the life world of the Russian village. Trotsky's hope that economic needs might lead to reconstruction of political life can likewise be understood as an intuitive grasp of life world resistance to systemic integration. For Habermas, normative claims relate to, quote, alternative orderings for the satisfaction of interests, end quote. Habermas, quoted in Stephen K. White's The Recent Work of Jürgen Habermas. The description for this book says, Jürgen Habermas is one of the foremost philosophers and social theorists in the world today, but the complexity and breadth of his thought make him often difficult to understand. In this book, Stephen White offers a clear, accessible, and reliable introduction to Habermas's work, particularly that which was written since the publication of Knowledge and Human Interests, produced in English in 1971. During this period, new themes and directions have emerged in Habermas's thought, which culminated in the theory of communicative action, a massive work that has not hitherto been the subject of extended commentary and analysis. This book is the first to provide a full-length study of Habermas's mature thought, locating the latter in the context of contemporary debates. Stephen White explains Habermas's ideas about action, rationality, communicative ethics, contemporary capitalism, and new social movements, which characterize his later work. White also examines Habermas's interpretation of modernity, showing that although, like Habermas's forerunners in the Frankfurt School, Habermas maintains a critical stance towards modernity's instrumentalization of reason, Habermas nonetheless offers a sophisticated defense of the universal significance of other aspects of modern consciousness that are too often forgotten by many recent radical critics of modernity. Throughout, Stephen White presents Habermas's work in such a way as to emphasize its coherence and to demonstrate how it constitutes the beginnings of a distinctive new research program in the social sciences. As a well-researched and lucid account of Habermas's thought, this book will appeal to readers wanting an introduction to the complexity of Habermas's ideas, as well as to those already conversant with them. It will also interest social and political theorists concerned with the general theoretical issues that it covers. Back to the text. End footnote. A normative consensus regulates, quote, legitimate chances for the satisfaction of needs, end quote, conceived in both material and ideal terms. A basic problem of the 1930s was that village norms of equality contradicted the functional need for highly differentiated incomes. It is from this contradiction that the internal tension in Trotsky's own thought arose. Opposed both to primitive egalitarianism and to the exaggerated privileges of the Stalinist bureaucracy, Trotsky hoped that the struggle over incomes and corresponding opportunities for self-expression might be communicatively resolved. Mutual recognition of legitimate needs would come through an institutionalized discourse concerning planning priorities. I was just going to say, as a side note, Trotsky definitely advocated a revolution against Stalinism, not merely creating space within Stalinism for economic and social, economic and political demands. Mutual recognition of legitimate needs would come through an institutionalized discourse concerning planning priorities. The problem was that Trotsky's philosophical commitment to enlighten was impossible to reconcile with the darkness of village culture. Trotsky is perfectly aware of the cultural as well as the economic obstacles to socialist democracy. In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky commented that, quote, "The Russian people never knew in the past either a great religious reformation like the Germans or a great bourgeois revolution like the French. Out of these, came bourgeois individuality, a very important step in the human personality in general," end quote. Trotsky. Trapped in material want and cultural backwardness, the Soviet peasant proletarians of the 1930s could not have been more remote from Marx's ideal of the universal worker. Recently torn from the countryside, the majority of Soviet workers did not possess the strength of personality, the stability of social bonds, or the communicative competence to resist the Stalinist administrative machine. As Habermas might say, the pre-industrial life world did not provide the inventory or interpretive patterns needed to impart meaning to the new conditions of life. Or as Trotsky commented, quote, "The very necessity of acquainting tens of millions of grown-up people with the alphabet and the newspaper, shows what a long road must be traveled before you can really speak of a new socialist culture," end quote. The pathos of Trotsky's hope for socialist democracies in the 1930s was evident in his own recognition that one of the first tasks of cultural modernization was to provide soap and a toothbrush to, quote, "millions who up to yesterday never heard of the simplest requirements of neatness," end quote. Trotsky. The Revolution Betrayed. When peasants had to be educated to stop beating their wives and spitting on the floor, how could Trotsky expect them to emancipate themselves from tyranny? How could there develop institutional mediation between the system and the life world when the life world was collapsing? How could socialist democracy be possible for millions of industrial recruits to whom industrialization was meaningless? The Habermasian reconstruction of social modernization helps to clarify Trotsky's theoretical accomplishments as well as Trotsky's limitations. Stalinism industrialized the Soviet Union within a system of totalitarian controls designed explicitly to prevent any awakening of social self-understanding. Today, this same process of modernization has set in motion the cultural and systemic differentiation described by Habermas. The complexity of social interaction has eluded the grasp of bureaucrats at the same time as life-world rationalization has generated the communicative competence of citizens who demand, quote, "good reasons" for the regime's continued existence. Recent developments confirm Habermas's thesis that discursive formation of political will presupposes cultural modernization, enabling citizens to negotiate for themselves a shared understanding of problematic situations and to coordinate their own action intentions. Trotsky was mistaken in thinking that political democracy would arise out of economic needs. He and Habermas would agree, however, that political freedom requires institutionalization in order that citizens might hold the laws and those who author them accountable for reasoned explanations. Quote, "mediation of the moments of reason," end quote, to whatever extent it remains possible, is unthinkable without a free and responsible discourse in the practical dialogue of political life. 50 years after his death, Leon Trotsky's political theory continues to direct our attention to fundamental issues on the modern agenda.